Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here, and also to the university for hosting us. Ms. Kenya, I wanted to ask...
And we're going to take you back live to the hearing of the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service. They're meeting at Gallaudet University in Washington to consider whether the U.S. should institute mandatory military or public service. Live here on C-SPAN 2.
Commission on Military, National, and Public Service. The purpose of this hearing is to address an important question. What are the potential needs for a voluntary or compulsory national mobilization? In 2016, the Commission was created amid a debate over whether the requirement for selective service registration should be extended to women after military combat roles were open to women in 2015. Congress charged us to answer two very important questions. First, does our country have a continuing need for a military selective service system, and if so, whether the current system requires modifications? And second, how can we, as a nation, create an ethos of service and increase participation in military, national, and public service? The first question is the reason we are here this afternoon. The 4 hearings we are holding today and tomorrow provide an opportunity to discuss the policy options the Commission is considering with respect to the selective service system and a potential for a future draft. This morning's hearing focused on the strategic security environment and potential requirements for selective service and the nation to meet those needs. This afternoon, our distinguished panelists will discuss their specific suggestions for how to modify the selective service system, as well as other mechanisms that might be used to support a national mobilization beyond the current levels of the all-volunteer force. The Commission is exploring the use of the selective service system to induct personnel with critical skills, changes to the selective service system structure and criteria for a draft, and mechanisms to encourage volunteerism in a national mobilization, including the feasibility and best structure of a national roster to source non-prior service volunteers for national security emergencies. Tomorrow, we will host 2 more hearings in which we will have the opportunity to discuss who should share the common obligation to defend the nation in the event of a potential future draft. So let me welcome our panelists. The Honorable Don Benton, Director of the U.S. Selective Service System, Major General John Evans, U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command and Commanding General of the U.S. Army Cadet Command at Fort Knox, Kentucky, Major General Linda Singh, Adjutant General of the State of Maryland, Maryland National Guard, Dr. Jacqueline Schneider, Assistant Professor at the U.S. Naval War College, and Dr. Bernie Rotzker, former Senior Fellow of the RAND Corporation. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'd now like to turn to our Vice Chair for Military Service, Ms. Wada, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the Vice Chair of Military Service, I'm honored to lead the effort regarding the selective service system and the military service for the Commission. When it comes to selective service and military service, we found one commonality, which is most Americans don't understand it. Although there is no draft, the selective service still very much exists and is active and should not be confused between the two. So most young men today register for selective service as a secondary process, whether through financial aid or through driver's license. And in fact, 75% of them register as a byproduct of another state or federal requirement. So registering is the law, and therefore if a male fails to register, there are ramifications, whether through being denied federal financial aid or employment with the federal or state governments. So as you may know, there was a district court case decided in Texas earlier this year, stating that all male military draft is unconstitutional. And earlier this month, the federal district court in New Jersey handed a second opinion which involving women in the selective service, issued an opinion denying the core parts of the government's motion to dismiss. Previously, the Supreme Court upheld the draft registration process in 1981 in Rosker versus Goldberg. The court ruled that a male-only draft was fully justified because women were ineligible for combat roles. And as we all know, that has now changed. So I look forward to hearing from Mr. Rosker this afternoon on his thoughts on that decision. But this decision will not speed up the Commission's timeline for releasing our report. But it does, however, make the Commission's work all the more important and relevant. And the Commission is considering whether there continues to be a need for the selective service in its current form, whether any changes should be made, and if they should be disestablished. So when it comes to changes, the Commission is looking at whether registration should be expanded to include women, whether we identify individuals who possess critical skills that the nation might need, whether we call for volunteers in a time of emergency instead, or incorporate reasonable changes to identify, evaluate, and protect those who will not serve in the military. So I look forward to hearing from our panelists today and on these very important issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Deborah. So before we begin, let me remind you to please silence any electronic devices you might have with you, and I'll now explain how we will conduct today's hearing. The commissioners have all received your written testimony, and it will be entered into the official record. We ask that you summarize the highlights of your testimony in the allotted 5 minutes. Before you, you will see our timing system. When the light turns yellow, you have approximately 1 minute remaining, and when it turns red, your time has expired. After all testimony is completed, we will move into questions from the commissioners. Each commissioner will be given 5 minutes to ask a question and receive a response. And once again, I remind commissioners that while I'm loath to gavel down a panelist, I am not as reluctant to gavel down a commissioner. Depending on time, we will proceed with 1 and possibly 2 rounds of questions. Upon completion of commissioner questions, we will provide an opportunity for members of the public who are in attendance to offer comments, either on the specific topic addressed today or more generally on the Commission's overarching mandate. These comments will be limited to 2 minutes. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds remaining and red when time has expired. We are now ready to begin with our panelists' testimony. I'd like to begin with the Honorable Donald Benton. Director Benton, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Heck, members of the Commission, and distinguished guests. My name is Don Benton, and just 2 years ago, I was appointed by the President of the United States to serve as the 13th Director of the United States Selective Service System. During this time, we have made significant improvements in the agency, which I will highlight today. I appreciate the work being done by the Commission, and we eagerly anticipate the Commission's final report and recommendations to Congress in March of next year. Those recommendations are critically important because the Selective Service is the third tier of defense to our nation, behind the all-volunteer active military and the military reserve component. Selective Service is a keystone to our readiness capabilities, one that the Department of Defense continually affirms, and we send a constant reminder to our allies and our detractors that we are united in our resolve to protect our freedoms. The Selective Service is the keystone. When I arrived at the agency, our annual budget was $23 million, virtually the same annual budget from 1983. To offset this financial erosion caused by inflation, we continue to leverage new technologies. Our fiscal year 2019 budget has been increased by Congress, approximately $3 million, and we will use this to focus on updating our IT systems and enhancing our cybersecurity. At a $26 million annual budget, this is an incredible bargain to the American taxpayer, as Selective Service is a hedge against unexpected emergencies. And the key word here, Commissioners, is unexpected. Rarely, if ever, do we expect a crisis or an emergency to occur. But it is the responsibility of the United States government to be prepared for the next unexpected emergency. The Selective Service is that preparation. We are ready now because of our active registration program. In 2009, the late Senator John McCain said, "I certainly hope we'll never face the requirement to reinstate the draft. But it's essential that we retain the Selective Service system and the means to do so." And every modern president has felt the same. During my preparations for today and in this morning's testimony, I saw and heard certain statements about registration methods that have been categorized as either secondary, passive, indirect, or even, some suggest, automatic. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is a misconception. These labels, placed by others, are false constructs. We do not use these terms at the Selective Service. To us, registration is registration, and registration remains an enduring civic duty. There is no meaningful distinction between any method of registration. The consent language on every registration method used by every registration partner we engage is clear and easy to understand. Copies of those have been included in my written testimony. A recent survey we've conducted shows that registrants know exactly what they're signing up for and where they did it. And in addition to providing manpower to the Department of Defense, we have to remember that the other part of our mission is providing alternative service opportunities for conscientious objectors. To fulfill this mission, the Selective Service has nearly 11,000 board members throughout the United States, locally in their own communities, to hear and decide requests from those seeking exemptions. And over the last 2 years, we've made significant improvements at the agency. Today, I'm very proud to say that the agency is fully capable of accomplishing our mission. For the first time in several years, we have successfully completed a series of mobilization exercises to ensure that we can perform our mission effectively and efficiently. The structure we use is one that is tried and true, although we continue to modernize and update that structure with the additional funding previously mentioned. Based on our small budget and our huge responsibilities, the Selective Service is one of, if not the, most efficient and cost-effective agencies in the entire United States government. In the future, should we be asked to further enhance our capabilities or add responsibilities, whether it be readiness or reach, we will do what the Selective Service has always done. We will rise and meet the challenge. Thank you for having me here today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Director Benton. Major General Evans, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fellow distinguished commissioners, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. As you know from your research thus far and from recent media reports, the Army has faced difficulties recruiting enough new soldiers to meet the nation's needs. As you discussed in your interim report, the eligible pool of young people who can meet the Army's enlistment requirements is shrinking. The number of young people with a propensity to serve and with awareness of opportunities for service is an area of concern. I'm grateful for the Commission's efforts to raise awareness of opportunities to serve in our Army and the other services. As the Commission's interim report states, family members of current or former service members are more likely to serve in the military. We find that this propensity to serve increases among college-enrolled youth as they learn more about what it means to be an officer. The United States Army Cadet Command is responsible for commissioning second lieutenants through the Army's Senior Reserve Officer Training Corps program and serves as one of the 3 principal Army commissioning sources, the other 2 being West Point and the Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia. Today, Army Senior ROTC has over 32,000 cadets enrolled in 975 host, crosstown, and extension units at colleges and universities across the country. Over 16,000 of these cadets are earning a college education with a senior ROTC scholarship. These 2-, 3-, and 4-year scholarships totaled approximately $348 million in 2019. With a rate of over 5,800 second lieutenants per year, senior ROTC is the Army's primary source for commissioning officers. While ROTC's name implies that our officers go on to serve only in the U.S. Army Reserve and National Guard, more than half go directly from college to the active Army. Last year, that total eclipsed 3,000 officers. Senior ROTC is the commissioning source for 63% of all Army active duty officers, including general officers. Women have been part of the senior ROTC for almost half a century. A pilot program developed in 1972 led to the first women enrolled in ROTC. Today, over 27% of our 32,000 senior ROTC cadets are female. Increasingly, these young women are choosing officer branches in the combat arms. Additionally, females comprise an even greater proportion of junior ROTC, over 40% of cadets in our high school program. This strong female representation in both the junior and senior programs represents just one aspect of the diversity of our cadet corps. Among our senior ROTC cadets, over 13% identify as African American, over 12% as Hispanic, nearly 8% as Asian, and 1% as Native American, with 2% identifying as other races. This diversity of gender and ethnic background is a significant attribute of the senior ROTC program. Students representing a variety of perspectives and thought processes strengthen our Army and support our engagements with military and civilian partners around the world. Army Junior ROTC represents the nation's third largest youth development program behind 4-H and Scouts BSA, and is comprised of over 304,000 high school students participating at over 1,700 programs across the nation. Junior ROTC's principal focus is citizenship and character development. And while Junior ROTC is not a recruiting program, approximately 20% of cadets express an interest in pursuing a military career. Were we to face a national mobilization, Army Officer Candidate School, or OCS, would be the primary source for commissioning new officers to meet the increased demand. Within its 12-week program, it is able to rapidly turn enlisted soldiers or civilians into commissioned officers. Expansion of OCS's capability would require an increase in funding, cadre, and administrative staff involving both uniformed personnel and Department of the Army civilians. In conclusion, two broad elements factor into meeting the nation's needs in the event of a national emergency: the availability of candidates with the required skill sets who are able to serve among our eligible population, and the ability of the armed services to rapidly transform able candidates into service members. Finally, a national mobilization effort requires a population of young adults who are able to serve. Holistic nationwide efforts should be made to address the two largest physical disqualifying factors for military service: a failure to meet fitness standards due to obesity and illicit drug use. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you today and for your work in supporting military, national, and public service. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Evans. Major General Singh, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, and fellow commissioners as well. I want to thank you for having me here today. I would also like to thank the employers that support my personnel during times in which they are called to duty. Without their support, we would not be able to do the things that we do, and I think they're often forgotten. In my role as the Adjutant General for Maryland, I oversee the Maryland Military Department, consisting of the Army National Guard, the Air National Guard, Maryland Emergency Management, and the Maryland Defense Force, which is an all-volunteer support force within our state. With almost 6,500 soldiers, airmen, civilians, and volunteers, we are uniquely positioned to answer the call to serve in times of global conflict, as well as responding when our Maryland citizens need us most. This uniqueness allows us to leverage a wide range of military and civilian skills across the landscape in which we serve. In the Maryland Guard, talent management is something that we take seriously. As a result, we have built a diverse leadership team, but realize that can be short-lived without a diverse pipeline to draw from. Finding, recruiting, training, and retaining our National Guard force is essential to meeting mobilization needs. Additionally, it is just as important to conduct challenging training to continue to prepare our members for the warfight, as well as for their homeland mission. It is also equally important to ensure our soldiers and airmen are concurrently fielded modernized equipment to remain interoperable with our active duty counterparts. Our members are all about service, and they want to train and serve to the highest standard possible. We recognize that the soldiers and airmen that make up the Maryland National Guard are our most valuable resource. The Maryland Military Department will continue to field relevant and ready forces to serve the needs of our citizens. I want to thank you for your support as we continue this new chapter in our long and distinguished service. Thank you.
Thank you, General Singh. Dr. Schneider.
Chairman Heck and distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for having me today. It's an honor to be included in this conversation. My name is Dr. Jackie Schneider, and I'm an assistant professor at the Naval War College. I'm also an Air Force reservist at U.S. Cyber Command, so I need to put the disclaimer that my comments today represent my own views and do not represent those of the U.S. Navy, the Naval War College, Cyber Command, or the Department of Defense. So I think it's all covered. I was asked today to speak about the skills and the capabilities of the future armed force and discuss the gaps in the force as well as potential solutions as we move forward. Too often our discussions of future warfare either draw on analogies of the past or present some sort of sci-fi, leaving us with the false choice of humanoid robots or G.I. Joes. The truth is that these things are not separate, and more than ever, technology and human beings are entwined in war and competition. Fighter pilots now spend more time strategizing data link integration than how to employ guns in a dogfight. Special operations forces rely on satellite relays and real-time technical intelligence. The arms race of today, both for winning competition and war, is not about technology. It's about technologists. Whereas the mechanization revolution created a whole new class of military professionals, today's warfare requires a new class of military professionals. Instead of machinery technicians, future warfare calls for data scientists, network engineers, cloud security specialists, satellite communications engineers, machine learning scientists, the list goes on and on. But these emerging technology missions will happen in conjunction with many of the bread and butter mission sets of today's military. Consequently, the force of future warfare will include data scientists and infantry officers, programmers and fighter pilots, graphic designers and logisticians, webmasters and special operations units. Technologists in this force will be located at research and lab centers in the United States, embedded in combat units deployed and at home, and within reserve and guard units focused on defending the nation against asymmetric threats. In addition, technological skills will become necessary capabilities for what would otherwise be core combat specialties. So if technologists are the key to winning great power competition and conflict, then how is the U.S. faring? The answer is that it's difficult to know. First, the U.S. has only begun to understand the technological skill sets it needs and is still largely unable to quantify what talent it currently has or how that talent stacks up against civilian, much less adversary talent. Second, in the skill sets that we do closely monitor, we've identified significant recruitment problems. For example, the Air Force continues to forecast a large pilot deficit, and all of the armed services are struggling to recruit, train, and retain cybersecurity professionals. I'm going to outline a few of what I see as the DoD's problems as it faces building that force of the future. The first is that the military is competing for this talent. In cybersecurity, for example, a 2018 study conducted by ISC2 identified a cybersecurity labor gap of almost 500,000 professionals. And the competition for talent goes beyond Silicon Valley. Pilots are also increasingly in demand, with civilian and cargo airlines seeking to replace their aging workforce with a shrinking supply of new commercial pilots. Additionally, the military draws from a smaller pool than these top civilian companies. Candidates must meet physiological requirements, whether that be passing physical fitness tests or baseline health assessments. Top technologists with asthma, some dental implants, IBS, or problems with pronation may not be medically qualified to serve in the armed forces. Recruiting and retaining this small pool of talent is an uphill battle for the DoD, and it's easy to blame this uphill battle on pay, but surveys suggest that top technologists are willing to sacrifice compensation for work satisfaction. And while the DoD offers a meaningful mission, more work needs to be done to increase overall satisfaction. Too often, individuals are asked to deal with unwieldy administration, including an overly complicated defense travel system, human resources applications that are often inaccessible from standard internet browsers, defense websites incompatible with non-PCs. Additionally, the accessions and promotion system struggles with non-traditional candidates and provides little flexibility for career progression, a major incentive for recruiting younger candidates. Related, the military traditional family life, which calls on military members and their families to move stations every 1 to 3 years, poses significant challenges for dual career couples. But there are solutions, and they can be cultural, organizational, and IT. Culturally, the military needs to evaluate their standards for grooming and physical fitness. It needs to work for creative progression opportunities, including fellowships in the civilian sector. And it needs to think about how it obtains and maintains security clearances for its individuals. Organizationally, the U.S. military needs to continue to look at creative ways to train and provide incentives for reserve and guard. The force of tomorrow is a force of technologists, And while it won't be easy to recruit, retain, or train the future armed forces, there are innovative solutions. Above all, the military must prioritize people and be willing to make cultural and organizational changes while investing in IT and processes that show the force that their service is valued.
Thank you, Dr. Schneider. Dr. Oscar.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, I appreciate the opportunity.
Dr. Oscar, please push your mic button there.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, I appreciate the opportunity provided today. My testimony really boils down to answering 4 questions. If the Military Selective Service Act is to be retained, what should be the structure of selective service in terms of requirements for continued registration and the supporting infrastructure? 2, should the Act be modified to include the registration and, if necessary, the induction of women? 3, how can the needs for critical skills be met? And 4, is there a need to maintain the current selective service system and the current law? So let me answer these, and then I'll be available for questions as we go forward. As I've argued in my recent paper, the current system of registration is ineffective and, frankly, less than useless. It does not provide a comprehensive nor an accurate database upon which to implement conscription. As I laid out, it systematically lacks large segments of the eligible male population, and for those that are included, the currency of information contained is questionable. Numerically, let me suggest that the database of those eligible for conscription should be at least 93% comprehensive and 98% accurate, levels that are far from achieved by the current system. An alternative registration system that can achieve these levels and does so in a timely fashion consistent with the Department of Defense's timeline for inductions is much preferred to the current system. I note that such a system was demonstrated as the registration in the summer of 1980 achieved these levels of comprehensiveness, accuracy, and did so well within the DoD timeline. In terms of the options being considered by the Commission, as presented in the staff memorandum, only one would meet these standards and still provide the supporting infrastructure to enable conscription to go forward. That option would be the one marked suspending registration. While a great deal of attention has been given to what form registration should take place, the registration itself is not the long pole in the tent. The resumption of conscription is based upon the maintenance of the critical infrastructure that would allow the process to go forward. I might also add, as the General commented, that a critical issue is the Army's ability to absorb conscripts, and that has been an area that has generally been overlooked as the focus has been on registration and selective service. Second question to be dealt with is, should the current Act be modified to allow for the registration and induction of women? I must confess to have very different views on this question. I am clear in my support for providing equal opportunity to men and women in the service. However, I am not so certain about equally compelling both men and women to serve, especially on equal footings. Here, my experience as Director of Selective Service during the Carter administration comes into play. While the administration clearly supported the registration of women, I was impressed by the heartfelt feelings of so many against that position. We clearly did not have the support of the Congress or the majority of the Supreme Court. In fact, the Chief Justice went so far as to invent facts in his majority decision in Roscoe versus Goldberg to reject the registration of women. The most recent district court ruling finding the unconstitutionality of a male-only draft also is not an endorsement for conscripting women. Rather, it is a blueprint for what the government needs to do to sustain the male-only draft. I cannot think of a more divisive issue than the conscription of women, an issue that clearly does not have to be addressed given the likelihood we will never return to a draft. This is a fight we really do not need to have. It is a fight that can and should be put off until a time when it might really matter. A time in the future where attitudes might have changed, the threat facing the nation would be clear and not uncertain and speculative, and a compelling case might be made. If this means that the Military Selective Service Act needs to be repealed, so be it, and I'll have more to say on that later. How can we meet critical skills? As noted in your staff memorandum, the key to obtaining critical skills either on standby or as needed is volunteerism and incentives. In the past, the so-called doctor draft was backed by the ongoing draft. The incentive of avoiding being drafted does not exist today. Other incentives, both pecuniary and non-pecuniary, will need to be found, and I endorse the Commission's actions in this account. So finally, is there a need to maintain the current MSSA? The need to maintain the current system is predicated on the following statement in the staff memorandum, and I'll quote, "Although the DoD has no current plans to rely on conscription, the nation has historically relied upon the SSS, the Selective Service System, to provide personnel to fight and win the nation's wars, and asserts that the United States must retain the ability to respond to unanticipated crises." This statement is misleading. It is an incorrect reading of our national history and the history of the military draft. In fact, pre-mobilization draft only existed after World War II and only for the conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, and proved so divisive in Vietnam that it was replaced by an all-volunteer force. We have engaged in active military conflict numerous times since 1973, when the all-volunteer force was established. And we did it without the help of the selective service system, including the longest conflict in our history. There are many reasons why we have been able to do so, which negates the need for conscription. Most significant is the change in military technology, which makes the need for a mass of untrained manpower, the very thing the draft provides, unnecessary and an actual burden. The fact is, the Army today does not need and cannot absorb the mass of untrained and unskilled men and potentially women the draft would provide. If history tells us anything, it is that when we have needed to build a mass army, as we did for World War I and World War II, there was sufficient time to develop a new selective system from scratch. In the former case, from a handbook written after the Civil War, and in the latter case, from the work of a planning cell at the Department of War. Such a cell could again meet any future needs for the reestablishment of the military draft. So my bottom line is that there is no need to continue registering people for the draft that will not come, no need to fight the battle over registering women, and no need to continue the Military Selective Service Act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Oscar. Based on the competing views, I give the staff kudos for their foresight in putting Director Benton and Dr. Oscar at opposite ends of the table. Yes, right. So, okay, thank you for your testimony. We'll now move into commissioner questions, and I'll put myself on the clock for 5 minutes. So, Director Benton, based on what you just heard from Dr. Rosker, so the question is, if the Selective Service system was to return to a kind of deep standby mode akin to that 76 to 1980 period where registration and boards were suspended, the workforce substantially reduced, what functions would be most difficult to reconstitute rapidly, and are there specific functions that are critical to maintain? Let's take that one first.
Thank you for the question.
Hit your button, sir, please. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. To paraphrase Captain Sullenberger, who saved hundreds of lives by landing on the Hudson, quote, "When it is time to perform, it is too late to prepare," unquote. I think we should all remember that quote, because to suggest that we could go into deep standby and register and mobilize at the same time, frankly, it is nearsighted and reliant on unsubstantiated assumptions to suggest that the Selective Service could be brought out of deep standby, able to simultaneously mobilize in a fair and equitable fashion in a short period of time. Based on our budget, 124 FTE, Selective Service is essentially already in deep standby. We're at the size and the budget buying power of the deep standby option laid out by the 1997 GAO report. Yet we still manage to register and exercise functionality of our mobilization structure. To further reduce the size of this agency would be catastrophic in the event that a draft is necessary. In the event of a national emergency, it would be difficult to reconstitute our mobilization structure that includes nearly 11,000 local board members in local communities who ensure fairness and equity in our system. The changing attitudes, in other words, the drop in civic activity, which is one of the primary reasons for this commission, would make it very difficult for us to reach high registration rates in a short amount of time. Absence of properly constituted local boards and extremely low registration numbers would result because a loss of fairness and equity would occur, which would be obvious to the American public. We are a national insurance policy, and we provide that insurance for the cost of 1/3 of a fully outfitted Apache helicopter.
Thank you. So how do you answer the claim made by some that the data collected, especially in today's increasingly mobile population, that the data you collect today at the age of 18 for registration is accurate enough to be able to locate somebody between their ages of 20 and 25, which are the most likely ages to be called up if a draft was enacted?
Great. That's a terrific question. It goes to the accuracy of our data, which has been questioned by several who actually aren't in the know on what we currently do. So thank you. If you'd asked me a year ago, Dr. Heck, I would have said, yeah, I'm not sure I'm 100%. Today, I'm 100% and absolutely confident in the accuracy of our data. In fact, we have determined that the address data in our RCV system for those that complete registrations exceeds 95% of accuracy at the time of registration. Now, our registration system and our business practices allow us and will allow us to meet our mission requirements related to mobilization. After the initial verification, we stop verifying addresses. We do not have a need to use that data unless the President and Congress activate us. Through several systems we've put in place, Veriform being one and others, we have the ability to verify the accuracy and change the data and track every registrant within a couple of days. So we don't see the need to spend our precious funding to update the system every day or every week because, frankly, it's out of date within a few hours of it being entered, as any database is. And so we reserve those funds, approximately $25,000, and we can update the entire system within a day or two. So we don't use the money to do that now. We will use the money to do it because we are capable of doing it in very short order at the time we are called upon to use that data. The other thing I want to point out is that we collect now, today, for the first time in the history of the agency, emails and telephone numbers. So we have a three-way triangulation to verify the data. So even if they moved out of their parents' house because they registered when they were in college, and they've then got married and they've moved a couple of times, phone numbers don't change today. Emails change, but much less often than addresses do. So we now have the capability of actually notifying and activating registrants within a few hours of the need to do so. And that's why I feel confident that we can absolutely mobilize under our current system.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Benton.
You bet.
Vice Chair Wada.
Dr. Beck, I wanted to follow up, though.
Yes, ma'am.
In our previous panel, we talked about sort of the potential for changes in the need for critical skills instead of sort of this draft of potentially unskilled labor pool that historically has been talked about.
Sure.
The selective service as it currently stands is not sort of set up that way to be able to identify those people with critical skills or skills that we would believe that are necessary in a future fight or future requirement. If we are to retain the selective service system and we need to be able to help identify those sorts of people, what would the selective service need to do to be able to do that?
Well, first, I agree with your premise. We do need to be able to identify critical skills. And if current law authorizes us to have a system, we would. We are not authorized under current law. We have a plan which we exercise, and we're very familiar with how to implement. We would be able to implement it, but we're not allowed under current law to actually expend funds on that.
Sure.
So we have a plan. We keep the plan updated. Of course, we would, I think it's 71 different medical professions, categories or classifications that we would use. But our current system is such that we can adapt it very quickly with the proper funding. And I understand we're on C-SPAN today for those members of Congress that are watching us. With the proper funding, the Selective Service can do anything you want us to do, right? Including registering women, if that's what Congress so decides. But it requires money. And as you've heard from my previous testimony, we've been on a deep standby life support budget for 40 years. And so it's pretty remarkable what our small team has been able to do and maintain. But with some additional funding in very short order, we would have a system up and running. We do have a current plan, but to implement it would take some additional funds.
Can I ask, though, because we talked about the difference between professions that require a licensing versus those that don't. So for technologists, most of them don't actually have a license. They have certifications. No one really tracks those certifications unless they're like the top 1% of 1% of that field. So how would the Selective Service go about sort of trying to, if we are in the future of a technology drain, how do we go out and,
Sure.
or how would the Selective Service do that?
Well, first of all, colleges give degrees in technology, okay? So we could follow college graduates that have been trained by our higher education facilities to do technological jobs. We can obtain that information from those universities and reach those people that way. We can also do it through a national publicity campaign, again, with proper funding, right? Because I believe that the patriotism level of America is high enough that we would obtain enough registrants in the particular categories that we were seeking with a proper outreach and education campaign on media. And again, in very short order.
But is it fair and equitable as the system is supposed to be set up to be if we're targeting, say, college graduates with IT degrees versus technologists who actually, technology firms are saying they don't need college degrees anymore. So how do we maintain that fairness when we go after certain sort of skill sets that are not easily identified in our population, and also balance that fair and equitable sort of, I guess, the core of what Selective Service is supposed to provide?
Great question. The fact of the matter is the fairness and equity system was designed for the all-inclusive conscription. When you reduce that down to a very specific skill set, obviously that affects fairness and equity if you're talking about the large group. The fairness and equity could be maintained within that technological group, certainly. But because you focused on a specific skill rather than no skills, clearly it's a different kind of a conscription, a different kind of a draft than what we currently do for actual military service. And so it would be up to the National Security Council, the Department of Labor. We do not maintain the authority, and nor do we profess to have the authority to determine what skills are necessary, what skills should be drafted, what skills shouldn't. That very clearly spelled out in Executive Order 13063, I believe, by President Obama, that the National Security Council and the Department of Labor will make those kinds of determinations, not the Selective Service. You bet.
Well, thank you very much to the entire panelists for your helpful testimony. This is enormously important to us. We thank you for that, as well as your own public service and commitment to the public good. I'd like to turn to some questions to you, Director Benton. I was struck in your testimony that you talked about, for many men, registering with the Selective Service was a pivotal moment in their lives, and many associate the registration and transition to adulthood for doing the right thing. And then I think in your oral testimony you said it's an enduring civic duty. Could you speak to that and how you see this process as a part of this enduring civic duty?
Absolutely. As a Scoutmaster and Merit Badge Counselor for civics and citizenship in the community, citizenship in the nation, and citizenship in the world, we stress in those trainings for young boys and young men the difference between duties and responsibilities and rights and privileges. When you live in America, you have rights and privileges that come with our Constitution and the many laws that Congress has passed. But they're not free. They come with duties and responsibilities. The duty to pay your taxes, the duty to vote, the responsibility to serve in the military to defend this great nation if that necessity arises, and many others. Follow the laws, right, and so on. And so when a young man who, or young woman, as the Commission or Congress may determine, reaches an age of adulthood, and they're getting their own car, and they're getting their own education, and they're getting their own home. And that's the time when you say, now that you're on your own, are you willing to step up and protect this nation if it comes to that? And I can tell you from traveling this country and the thousands of men that I've talked to, it is a proud moment for them when they make that decision.
So if I could follow up then, because you said the right to vote as well. You'd kind of pair that as a privileged civic duty. Could you imagine the Selective Service system being a vehicle to register young Americans to vote as another enduring civic duty?
No.
And because?
It would water down our focus. Our focus is to be prepared to protect this nation in an unexpected emergency. And that's what we should focus our very limited $26 million budget on. Again, as I said at the end of my other testimony, Commissioner Guerin, if Congress decides that our structure is so great, which I believe it is, that we could accept other responsibilities and or duties.
I noted that you said,
I think we could do that, but it would take the money to do it.
You
obviously.
said, I think in your testimony, you said if we're asked to enhance our capabilities,
correct,
we will rise to meet the challenge.
That is correct.
So if that was the challenge,
we could do it.
You could do it. Thank you.
We would do it. I mean, if Congress, we work for Congress and the President of the United States, and we will do what they tell us to do.
But you see nothing that could prevent that?
Yes. Funding.
Anything else?
No.
Thank you.
Dr. Snyder, in your testimony, you listed several skill sets. At what age group would you consider important or sufficient to capture the number of skill sets that you listed?
At what age?
Yes, age group, range.
Yeah. As the vice chair mentioned, a lot of these technology professions actually include individuals that do not have a college degree. Whereas in the past, the ladder for IT was you got a computer science degree, and so you came out at 22, and then you started working, and that has drastically changed. You still have a large amount of the very top talent that's coming out of a standard education process where they're getting their undergraduate, their master's, potentially their doctorate. Now, if you're looking at people who already have their doctorate, you're looking at people who are in their late 20s to late 30s as being the primary there. But the reality is that these IT capabilities, and especially the more non-traditional skill sets like the hacking community, in that community you might see people who are quite good at what they're doing at 18. A lot of the people who are winning the tech talent competitions around the world are quite young. That said, at the older end of the spectrum, you have individuals that are much better at managing tech portfolios. So it's where you see your program managers and your executive IT directors. So there's probably a peak period of technological capacity that would range somewhere in the early 20s to mid 30s. But the reality is that people who are working at the top of their game here are going to be doing that up until their 50s, 60s.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Rosker, you had mentioned several things I found fascinating, but up until recently, as Director Benton reported, the Selective Service had been restricted from doing any exercises, certainly joint exercises with DOD. What do you see are the benefits of doing those kinds of things? How frequently should that occur? And do you see a value in doing an integrated exercise with DOD and Selective Service?
The only advantage would be to put a clear spotlight on the longest pole in the tent, and that is DOD's ability or inability to absorb the kind of mass numbers that the requirement has been laid upon Selective Service. In my experience, and I don't think things have markedly changed, the Army was not capable of absorbing the numbers. The GAO was very much on the Selective Services case about registration. And once we demonstrated that we could have an emergency registration that met the kind of numbers I talked about, initially 93% compliance and 98% accuracy, then the GAO switched and said, well, that's nice, but the real problem is the Army's inability to absorb those numbers. So I don't think an exercise would be necessary, but I do think that the capability suggested by the director is easily tested. And within the timelines he's suggesting, or in an implementation of the system that he says exists, the General Accounting Office could well do what they did with the 1980 registration, and that is randomly select individuals in the database and see who responds to the phone call. In our case, we registered what we believed was 93% of the population. The GAO pulled several hundred records and made phone calls. And we're able to determine that I think out of 200, they got one Mickey Mouse. and they were able to make contact. And if you look at the GAO report, it certifies as to what the accuracy was. Let me say that in one very important area, I agree with the director. The critical issue in standby is not registration. It's the boards, it's the infrastructure. We would have immediate court challenges if we went forward with an induction order based upon an 80% or a 70% population with questionable numbers. So getting those numbers right is important. It does take time. It will take resources. It is the boards. It's exercising the boards. That is the critical issue, not the focus on registration. Okay. Having said all of that, one might say, is it all worth it, particularly given the situation with the constitutionality of women, to have all of these fights, given the fact that it is very unlikely. And if we had to reconstitute the registration, there's no doubt in my mind we could do so meeting the guidelines with a post-mobilization registration, as we demonstrated in 1980. Not theoretical, demonstrated.
Okay, thank you very much. I see my time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Major General Evans, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for your distinguished career and service to our nation, leading men and women. We've been talking about this idea of identifying, perhaps for registration purposes, critical skills. One approach that the Commission is taking a look at that is a little different than that would be to create a national roster or a civilian strategic reserve that would involve people who, out of their sense of voluntarism, perhaps with some incentives that would encourage them to do this, to be willing to identify themselves, self-identify, prepare to employ their critical skills for the needs of the nation when it is used. I wonder if you can help us as we think about how that might translate into a rapidly mobilized capability, how such an organization could be organized, and what types of training would be most effective in order to take those people who have skills that they've learned in industry or in academia and translate them into the skills and the capabilities needed by our military.
Yeah. Thank you, Commissioner Barney. I'll give that a shot. I think, as Honorable Benton said, we don't have that type of structure right now, so it's very difficult to reach into the civilian populace and pull out what those skill sets are. I can't speak for all of DOD, but specifically to the Army, I can tell you that we've taken a look at our talent management processes, and we found ourselves a bit lacking. Our processes are a little industrial scale. We need to make them a little more agile and a little more adaptable. So we are implementing a new system called the Integrated Personnel and Pay System Army, IPS-A, which will give us an opportunity, as we field it over the next several years, to bring people into the Army and capture some of those more nuanced skill sets that may not be part of a formal training program in the Army or what they're doing with regards to their basic training. With regards to how that translates from the civilian sector to what we would do in the Army, if we were to put together such a reserve on the civilian side, and we could tie that reserve process into the Army process in accordance with law and policy, that might give us an opportunity to very quickly identify the talent we need and then move it quicker to the front of the line for training. Currently, we do accelerate training in some instances. What we do with regards to expanding our training base in the Training and Doctrine Command requires time, requires additional resources with regards to trainers principally. And the way that we accelerate training for some is we will directly commission those who have particular skill sets. You'll see that with our legal profession, our medical profession, our chaplaincy, and most recently our cyber corps, those who have those types of skill sets. But I think that's one angle we could look at to get after it.
Dr. Snyder, in a lot of the work that you've done to study these technologists that are going to be such a key part of our national requirements in the future, as well as some of the things that you've done to highlight the challenges of the personnel system, I wonder, as you think about individuals you've interacted with who have a foot in our, both academia and technology, people who might be interested or willing to participate in such a national corps, do you have any insights as to the types of things that might motivate individuals to put their name forward to serve in that capacity, and how the services might be able to best capture them and have them ready to act when the time is needed?
Sure, and I think this is a really fabulous question. I see a lot of individuals who really want to give, and they want to serve, and they know that they have talents that can be used in unique ways. We're never going to compete on pay. They're always going to make more money in the civilian world. But work satisfaction and a belief in something bigger than yourself has been one of the dominant themes of Silicon Valley. Part of the problem we're having today is that the narrative of Silicon Valley about how to be bigger than yourself is an anti-government narrative. So something has to be done to work with the private sector to make us understand that both the private sector and the government are kind of on the same page. So there's, I think that's something that has to be accounted for. But the other thing that has to be accounted for is that right now, we don't have easy ways to bring these people into the military fold. We do have some direct commissioning programs, but it's hard to keep those people gainfully employed in the mission that we ask them to do. So there are these kind of small civilian groups like the Defense Digital Service, where you're recruiting people who are kind of high top technologists and you're giving them these very specific and bounded projects, and then they're able to use their skill sets within these bounded projects, which has been relatively successful for such a small group of people. But we're not seeing the same kind of like success per people once you get into the people actually having to go into the services. Because once they're in the services and they're in the military, then we have all of the administrative requirements of being a military member. You have your computer-based trainings, you have all the physical requirements of being part of that service. And so if we're taking people whose time is really valuable, and we spend most of their time on kind of making them Air Force or making them Army or making them Navy and not letting them do the mission, then we lose satisfaction and it becomes difficult to retain those people.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for being here this morning and for your compelling testimony. I'd like to start with Dr. Rosker. Dr. Rosker, in your testimony, when you were describing the recent district court decision or ruling, you described it as not an endorsement for registering or conscripting women. Rather, it's a blueprint for what the government needs to do to sustain the male-only registration and draft. Would you please explain what you mean by that?
I'm not a lawyer, so my lay reading of the opinion was that it was full of the argument that the government made an assertion and the courts found that there was no basis for that assertion. Not dismissing the assertion, but pointing out that the government had not made the case, had not collected the data, had not demonstrated that there was for example, a high probability that most women might not meet the physical standards of combat training. That was one of the assertions. Where was the data to demonstrate that? So to me, in reading it, the judge was saying, well, go do the analysis. If you make this assertion, then collect the data, do the test that will sustain that. If it cannot be sustained, then obviously there's no basis for that statement. But if it can be sustained, he was leaving the door open, in my reading, to say, well, maybe that would be a logical reason to exclude women from registration. So I think it was saying to the government, you're really sloppy. You're doing what was charged of the Rehnquist decision, the old canard about the role of women. If you look at the history of women in the combat exclusion. If you go back to the early 1970s, it was impossible for women to serve forward of the division rear. And then it became the brigade rear, and then it kept marching forward. And today, we've eliminated the combat exclusion. So I viewed that opinion not saying you have to register women, or the court made the decision that there's no validity to the government's case, just that the government's case had not been demonstrated and needed to be demonstrated if we were to continue a male-only registration.
Thank you. Continuing with you, and then also Director Benton, if you would give us your thoughts. The Commission has heard from many in the conscientious objector community who have advocated for the ability to self-identify as conscientious objectors during the registration process, among other modifications. What's your evaluation of the selective service system's processes to protect conscientious objectors, and what additional modifications would you consider?
Great. Me first.
Either Dr. Rasker.
We believe in the system that we have. We think it's a pretty good system. We have a great relationship with peace churches throughout the United States, the conscientious objector community. We engage with them on a regular basis, as I'm sure Mr. Allard knows from his time at the Commission. We believe it would be unnecessary, slow down the process, and create a larger image of an unfair system if people were allowed to sign off as conscientious objectors first. It's totally unnecessary unless Congress and the President actually mobilize. So we don't need to know ahead of time. And we do have a system in place, if we do mobilize with our local boards, where that decision is being made in the local community where that young man or young woman potentially would come from. And so we believe that's a much better system than having a military tribunal make those kinds of decisions, or allowing people to self-opt out ahead of time so they wouldn't even be considered or reviewed by one of those local boards in terms of the necessity and or the sincerity of their claim. And so the current system seems to work well. It has worked well. The local boards work well. And we believe that there's no reason to allow people to opt out before there is a need for them to show that they are a conscientious objector.
I would have no objection for a checkbox. It would have no meaning. If it made people feel better that they checked it, fine. But they would still and have to identify themselves when they had an induction notice that they were applying for status as a conscientious objector, and present their case to the local board. But if it would make them feel better when they registered that they could check a box, you know, why not?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all for coming today. Really appreciate your insights and your perspectives. Dr. Schneider, welcome. Some of the comments that you made about the headaches that people have in serving in the military really resonated with me as a former military pilot. Boy, and I'm looking at some junior officers in the crowd too, computer-based training. Who doesn't love DTS, Defense Travel System, planning the squadron Christmas party, you know, all those things that just, you know, who wants to do that stuff, man? So I'm going to turn to our two uniformed members here, Major General Singh and Major General Evans. These are perennials, right? We've heard them for a long time. But it does seem like in this particular community, they got better choices. And so do you envision a way where the culture and the structures and the processes of the uniformed military can adapt to this new world? We have, and you know, people with family issues, the 20th century model of a single earner that, you know, you don't have dual income families, high-powered people marry high-powered people. You want high-powered people serving in the military. How can we adapt to these people's zigzaggy lives and their needs? Or do we need a different model?
So first, I want to thank you for that question because I'm the mom of two very interesting millennials that are completely different. One's a police officer and one's going to medical school. And the thing that I hear, and just from my perspective, my youngest, who is about 120 pounds, can bench lift probably most of who's here. So I feel pretty safe with whatever field that she chooses to go in. But when I think about our millennials and I think about the new age, we can really dance all around the issue of whether it should be women or not. It actually makes me feel a little less, having worn the uniform for 38 years. I'm just saying, I guess I don't matter then, but got it. But let's just really look at what the issue is. We need to be able to continue to support a volunteer force. And if we're going to do that, then how do we reach the young population that are the future leaders of tomorrow? And when I think about that, what we are looking at is we go out in the schools. They need to know what options are available. And it's not just for them to serve in uniform. I worry about them serving in state and local government just as well. And so we're trying to help them to see what options they have. And if we could have a system where it is very easy for them to roll in and out of service into industry, maybe it's into federal government, maybe it's into local government, but we don't have a system that allows us to be able to do that today. The closest that you get to that is the National Guard and the Reserve. And so then when I look at, just my force alone, and we talk about how do we get volunteers, well, I kind of disagree that I can't track individuals with skills because my all-volunteer defense force, while we are really trying to get at a younger generation, because when I first became the adjutant general, my all-volunteer defense force, I'm not going to say what age they were because I don't want to get in trouble for age discrimination, but they weren't at the level in which we needed them to. Great folks, amazing people, but I needed a different category of individuals. And so we really started recruiting volunteers. These are individuals, so I have about 250 volunteers right now today that have very high technical skills. Some are doctors, some are cyber professionals, some of them are engineers, some of them are chaplains, some of them are lawyers, where they volunteer their time to support us within the state. So if you looked at that model and you go back to where does that come from? The constitutional model comes from the state militia. And that's really, where they were at. And so if we were to really look at, maybe we need to look into what does it mean to get our young folks to start serving very differently. We asked them to do community service. So let's change that model. In 9th grade, they have to do a semester someplace. We have to decide where that place is. In 10th grade, they have to do a semester someplace. In 11th grade and in 12th grade, then they get the opportunity to say, now I have a choice. Because it should be a choice. And when I think of it, I made a choice to come in at 17. And I was a high school dropout. And I'm now sitting here as a 2-star general. So you have to say, where do you get folks? How are you going to inspire them to be able to not just sit here, but to, maybe they're going to be, when I think of Secretary Wada, maybe they're going to be like, someone like herself, right? But we're not getting to the heart of it. And so we can dance all around the issue, we can cloud the issue, but we need to get to the heart of what is it that's going to make our young people want to serve in public service, whether it's uniformed or not.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Benton, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your testimony and your defense of the registration system. And when I think of selective service, I don't believe it to be a registration system. I believe it to be a draft system. And registration is one step of that. It's a means to an end. And so in one of your answers to Mr. Guerin earlier, you said as you go out and you talk to young men, you said, you talk to them about the education process, and you say, are you willing to step up and protect this nation? And I like that because I think it signifies to them the responsibility they're undertaking. But I noticed in the materials you provided with your testimony the driver's license applications for Texas, Montana, Virginia, and some other materials, it doesn't
Say that.
say that. It doesn't tell young men who are eager to get their driver's license and would do almost anything to get that at that time, that they are potentially putting their life on the line. It says you're going to register with selective service. One of them says military selective service, but it doesn't tell them the consequence, the potential consequence of what they are undertaking. Is that fair to our young people?
Thanks for the question, Commissioner Kilgannon. I appreciate that. The fact of the matter is, we should give our young folks a lot more credit than that. Unlike previous generations, this generation carries around a palm-sized computer with them all the time. I don't think it's unreasonable at all to think that a young person, if they had a question about what the selective service was, that they could whip out their little Apple or other device and look it up and read it. We have thousands and thousands of hits every day to our website. I think it's unreasonable to think that young people today don't pay attention to what they sign, especially on their driver's license application or their FAFSA college form application. I think they do pay attention to what they sign. I have 4 children, 3 boys. All 3 of them knew exactly what they were doing when they signed the FAFSA form, because if you look at question 9 and then go to the book that they provide for you, as we do on tax returns and every other government form, where you go to see what do they really want in that question, and you read what FAFSA was looking for, it makes it very clear what you're signing up for. As I
So it's common practice for them to read the fine print, is what you're telling us?
I think when you're filling out a government form, if you don't look at the instructions on filling out the form, you run a very high risk of filling out the form incorrectly, and I think most Americans know that. So I do think they do additional research as they're filling out these forms. However, the form itself, even without the additional research, as I've indicated, makes it very clear that they are signing up for the selective service. So yes, I think it's open, clear, and widely known. At least in a recent survey that we conducted, over 600 respondents, we asked them how did they ever hear of the selective service, and they knew exactly where they'd heard of it. From a family member, from a driver's license. If they didn't think they were signing up for the selective service or military, they wouldn't have been able to answer that question. That's just most recent. We did that about 2 weeks ago. And so we are very confident that most folks know exactly what they're doing. I'm fully aware that this commission has heard from people who claim that they don't, but I believe that is a minute minority in America.
So you have a lot of confidence in our young people, and you expressed that in an answer to a previous question about the level of patriotism being high. Is that level of patriotism high enough to sustain a voluntary selective service registration process?
That would be up to Congress and the Department of Defense, and again, maybe the National Security Council to decide. I don't know the answer to that question, and I'm not afraid to tell you I don't know. I hope so. I hope so. Because like John McCain, I pray to God I'll never have to activate or mobilize this agency. But I also pray to God that if I'm required to, I will be ready to do it the way it's supposed to be done. That's my mission, that's my job, and that's what everybody at the Selective Service today is committed to.
Good.
We don't have the luxury of thinking about other options. As Sullenberger said, when it comes time to act, the time to prepare is past.
Thank you, Director. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thanks very much for taking the time to do this with us today. I want to dig into the skills set and skills-based issue, and in a way, drawing off of Steve's questions. I think, let me put them into 2 categories. One category might be in the context of trying to attract the talent and the skills that we need in our civilian and in our military space. And I think, technologists are a clear part of that, but there's also other types of skills that are critical to our national defense. And And that question of mobilization and trying to compete for the talent and bring them in and recruit them, I think is a key one that you've talked a little bit about. One question that comes up for us is in the context of registration or in other places, can we use that to identify skills, right? And is that useful for recruiting purposes? And it's not really the intent of the registration system, right? I mean, the registration system is really there to help us essentially in the event of a national emergency to mobilize folks, but it is something that comes up on a frequent basis, that this might be a space where we might identify people and that could be useful to us. And it is rife with all of the issues that have sort of been surfaced in different ways, which is that we're focused on a subset of the population between 19 and 25 that isn't necessarily going to have the skills that we're looking for at that period of time.
Correct.
And in many circumstances, it's not as easy to identify in the context of particular types of skills, you know, unlike the medical field or other things. So I would love to hear from Dr. Schneider and General saying just your perspective on whether or not that's a useful thing. And then I'll put out the other question that I've got. In the context of a national emergency, where we need a particular skill set, and we need to draw on that skill set. That's also been something that's been suggested to us at least, and it's unclear how likely that scenario is. But it does seem to me, and I think General Singh, you'd be particularly positioned to answer this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts too, Dr. Schneider, just how feasible is it for us to actually integrate skill sets like the ones that you can imagine we would need in that circumstance into the force in the context of a national emergency? Is that really a reasonable scenario, and how would we prepare for that? Thank you.
So the question first about can we identify the skills? The age group is a difficulty because so many of these skills, you know, are kind of additive, and so as that moment in time where they answer a question doesn't represent where the skill sets are. And to be fair, in technology, 5 years from now, the programming languages have changed, the core specialties. I mean, 10 years ago, we weren't talking about cloud security, and now that's one of the kind of core competencies. So that's a real challenge, and in some ways would have to be living and constantly updating, which is very difficult logistically. But in the question about integrating skill sets, I think the National Guard has actually started thinking about this in a very concrete way. The National Guard has taken real measures to create teams that are prepared to help with the defend the nation and the response to cyber emergencies, partly because of where it sits legally in terms of its ability to act on the domestic, within the domestic populations. And there are states who have done a really good job of integrating core critical infrastructures with specific cyber protection teams. So you have, for example, an electrical power supply company. And the great thing about the Guard is you can have members of the Guard who spend their day-to-day operations actually working on the SCADA systems or working on the ICS of those critical infrastructures. And then if there were to be an attack, it's easy then for that person to put on their Guard hat. Now they have the authorities delegated to them from the Guard side that allows them to do things that they can't do in their civilian capacity, but they know the networks. Because one of the big problems, especially when it comes to cyber incidents, is that each of these companies and each of these infrastructures have very different types of networks and softwares. And so having somebody that's already in the company and already understands how that works is like a huge asset. And that's something that the Guard brings in a unique way, even above and beyond the reserve.
So just to add on to that, I think what makes it challenging is that once they're in the service, it's easier for us to be able to track the skills, but we're still not even there yet. And as you know, Major General Evans even mentioned, when we get to the integrated pay and personnel system, which is different for the different services, but when you think about that in general, it gives us the ability to be able to track some of that, but it's only as good as the data that you put in. So that's great for those that are already service members, but then we're talking about trying to recruit a population that we don't even know where their skill sets are, what do they have, and what I want to be really careful about is that should we ever have to go forth where we are going to be calling not only God and country, but you're calling the Guard, you're calling the reserves, you're calling everybody, and then we're asking for those to come in behind us. When you start looking at that, I think that we're kind of really, we are lying to ourselves if we think it's only going to be in technological skills. It is going to be everybody la-di-da-di. I hate to say that term, but we're going to need logisticians that have technical skills. We're going to need mechanics. We're going to need drivers. We're going to need everything because that's the way the system works. And when I think about just across the board, it's about how do you get at that bigger group. And we will have some critical skills that maybe we need to focus in on. And I would say when we get to that point, we need to do some public service announcements. Because I think that if I was to say in the state of Maryland, I guarantee you if I went and said I needed volunteers, and if you think just back to the civil disturbance in Baltimore, my God, we didn't even have to ask for volunteers. We got volunteers we didn't need. And so you will get volunteers that are going to step forth. But if we don't have a process to be able to handle that, if we don't have a process to be able to integrate them, we will overburden the system. And so we will find ourselves in a very challenging position. And so I think there's two different issues that we have to look at. That's the ones that are not even in uniform yet, how do we get at that skill set? And then the ones that are in uniform.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Benton, if I could, I'd like to try and stitch together some of the things that have been mentioned here and get your opinion on a thought that we've had in our conversations as commissioners. Some of the words that you've mentioned and explained very thoughtfully are your consideration of fairness and equity with regard to registration. And then you've also talked about how you impart learning with regard to duty and responsibility in there. What I'd like to try to get at is your appreciation of the government side of those considerations of duty and responsibility when it comes to the individual. Where does the government's role, responsibility come into play? And thank you for your testimony and your response with regard to how registration is considered, primary versus passive and secondary. So it's with regard to that. So we've got, and that's with regard, primarily it comes up to do with driver's license applications and how that interacts with registering for the Selective Service. We got 50 states, DC, the territories. How many of those bodies does the Selective Service System have agreements with for registration purposes?
We have, let me make clear, these are not agreements. These are state laws.
Right.
Passed by state legislatures.
Okay.
Signed by governors of states, Democrat and Republican. So it's a state law.
Do those come about as a part of your interactions with them, or they just organically occur?
41.
41.
To answer your question, 41 plus the state of Alaska, which uses the permanent fund rather than the driver's license.
Understand.
Okay, because every citizen there gets a check from the permanent fund.
41 out of 55, I think 55, 56.
Well, there's only 50 states.
DC and the territories.
And we have 41 agreements, right?
So not every territory someone lives in.
Yes.
Is that facility to register made available to them?
DC is one.
Gotcha.
Okay, which really is a great
So it's
model.
not universal across the United States, depending upon the area.
All but 7 states, I think, do it. Right?
So
including
there are penalties for failure to register, potential penalties, lack of access to federal jobs.
Federal law lays out a number of penalties for
So with regard to, is there a responsibility on the government side with regard to the potential vulnerability or peril of penalties when I could be a male who, as was mentioned in the morning panel, fewer and fewer Americans seek driver's licenses now as a result of the economy and how things are going. If I don't have a need or my life's journey doesn't take me towards college during the age of required registration, therefore I don't hit the FAFSA process perhaps, which means a couple of opportunities, my word, to be caught by other systems to get me to register. Yet later in life, I'm vulnerable to it where if I had decided to pursue a driver's license, if I had been wanting to go to college and needed aid and went through the FAFSA process, I'd be presented additional opportunities and requirements to register. Does that impact the fairness and equity of how people become in jeopardy of being penalized for something, or depending upon where you lived or you grew up, and that you had more opportunities, my word again, to be caught by the system to say, you should register, where I take your point very, to heart about duty and responsibility, understanding as a citizen your obligations to the nation.
Right. That's a great question, and no, I don't. I guess I would liken that to the fact that should we run public service announcements that tell you you're going to go to prison if you steal or rob from people? I think, most Americans probably know that. We work with every high school in America. This last year, we mailed every high school principal a letter and posters. So we are trying to be ubiquitous for that very reason, Commissioner, because we don't want, it's a horrible thing to have to tell someone, I'm sorry, we can't verify you, and it's up to your agency then. Now, the agencies are the ones that determine the willful or not. We don't make that determination. We simply, yes, they're registered, no, they're not. And so different government agencies can make different determinations based on what their perception in their interview and their background investigation. We simply provide the yes registered, no registered. But our job is through outreach. Now, because of the budget, this agency used to spend a lot of money on public service announcements and television advertisements, and we had 750 reserve force officers that went out into America and spread the word. Today we have less than 150 reserve force officers, simply due to budget. But we do a fairly remarkable job still in terms of maintaining those relationships with high schools, right? Still getting some public service announcements aired. In fact, this last year we were able to get 10 major airports in America to have a major effort to educate the community. And so we continue to reach out in interesting and different and diverse ways. I think of a hockey rink in Burlington, Vermont, where we bought an ad, where they play all the state hockey games. I mean, that's pretty important. We reach out to every superintendent of public instruction in each state when we do an outreach trip there. I've been on several outreach trips. We meet with the governor. We try to get the schools involved. We also meet with judges. I did an outreach trip to Hawaii. I met with a juvenile court judge. We talked to them about maybe it would be a good idea to make sure that your juvenile probationaries are not violating federal law by being registered for the Selective Service. It would be a good opportunity there. And so we are trying to be ubiquitous. That is our goal. It's hard to do with the funding we have, but we are trying to make sure that everyone knows, because as I said earlier, it is heartbreaking to me to have to tell someone, sorry, we don't have any record of your registration. And it's a small percentage of folks, okay? But even a small percentage is too many, right? And so we continually try to innovate and reach out, which is why we have evolved the Paperwork Reduction Act. We have to comply with that. So our processes have moved over the years from paper to electronic. We don't think they're any less effective or any less transparent, but they are easier, and they make it easier for people to register. And that's our goal. We want to inform, educate, and make it easy for the youth population to register. So we've moved from 98% paper registrations, where you go to the post office, about 8% of our registrations come in through those printed forms now. And our, what we call registration partners, DMVs, recruiting stations, because they make sure that even though they sign up that they register. All of our partnerships, whether it's the Alaska Permanent Fund, the driver's license, the Department of Education, we make sure that they make it clear to their folks what folks are signing up for. But we'd like to have more partners. We want more government forms. We want to reach out to more people. We don't want to leave anybody behind, because we want people to know. Now, if you know and you choose not to, that's your choice. And that's the beauty of it in America, is you can choose not to if you don't want to. There are consequences, just like there are for any other choice that Americans may make. But what I don't want is for someone to not be able to receive the benefits and not having known about it. That's not right, and we want to try to rectify that.
Thank you for going down the path with me and for such a fulsome answer, and I appreciate the chair's indulgence.
And I think we can rectify that if we had a little more funding for some more publicity, honestly.
Thank you all for, first of all, for your own service to our country and for sharing your thoughts with us today. My question is for Dr. Rotzker. So if I understand in your testimony and what you've written, you are recommending that we keep the selective service system in place, but we get rid of the registration process and we do a post-mobilization registration. How would that work? Why do you think it would be better? And what would you say to people, some of who've testified to us, to say, well, having the registration, it's a deterrent to potential adversaries to say that we have the result?
Let me deal with the adversary question. That was the issue or the argument that convinced President Carter to call for the registration. That argument was sustained for about 10 days. It was, Congress completely rejected it, and it just made no sense to the people who were dealing with it. It goes back to the World War II and the single vote that sustained the registration. The fact is that everything we just heard about all of the efforts and the dealings and driver's license, totally useless, absolutely unnecessary. If the goal is to have a comprehensive list that can be that's accurate, that can be drawn on, which is consistent with the DoD timeline, there is no reason to have an ongoing registration. We demonstrated in 1980 that we registered the last week in July, the first week in August, and by mid-September, we had a list that was 93% comprehensive and expanded from there, that the GAO certified was 98% accurate, and that was well within the DoD timeline. There is no reason to have an ongoing registration. The only argument that really has had any currency was it reminds the young man that he has an obligation, but we've undercut that by doing it through driver's licenses, by having it passive. As the director said, 90% of the people had to go and make the positive step of going to the post office, facing a government official, although it was simply a postal clerk, and filling out a form. But we've eliminated that. Doesn't have to do anything. Waits, he gets this letter which says, by the way, we've registered you. And that's the entire contact. Where is the commitment? You want to have a commitment, then have a real commitment. But you can do that with a post-mobilization registration. The statement that we need to be prepared and it's too late. Yes, we need to be prepared to have a post-mobilization registration. If you want to print the forms and have them in warehouses, fine. If you want the procedures, I can show you the handbooks that had those procedures. Post-mobilization registration. When President Carter said in the State of the Union, we're going to register, we implemented the post-mobilization registration. The week before, the Postmaster General had signed a memo of agreement that in an emergency, that the post offices would be the place of registration. I had the pleasure of calling him 1 week later and saying we were implementing the emergency registration. And we did the entire country for the price that it would have taken to mobilize the election mechanisms, which was the old way of registering, in California. And we did it with timely, accurate, comprehensive. The question you asked about what states, I think California does not share driver's license. So, hey, move to California. You're basically exempt from being drafted because if you don't want to go to college, if you don't want to get a government job and have aid, the government's never going to find you. That's wrong. The publicity that we had that the money flowed once the decision was made that we were going to have registration. All of that gave us a 93% registration comprehensiveness and 98% accuracy. We met the timelines. There is no need for a continuing registration.
I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Do I get to respond to that?
So that concludes the first round. Hopefully, everybody's doing okay, and we'll just dive right into round
Mr. Chair,
two.
do I get to respond to that last question?
Well, as we go back around through the second round of questions. So we'll go into round two and still make sure we have enough time towards the end for public comment. So, General Evans, we've heard Dr. Rosker's talk about the long pole in the tent with the military's ability to absorb. You mentioned it yourself. Under the current timeline of the first inductees to MEPS at 193 days, and then the first 100,000 by day, I think it was 205. With the assumption that if we are now mobilizing folks, that the vast majority of the active duty force and reserve force is already engaged, and the Army being probably the biggest recipient of inductees, what's the plan? How in the days of the constricted force and BRAC, how are you going to absorb those inductees and get them out the door in time to engage in the fight?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. It's a great question, and I appreciate you asking it. It's a wicked problem for us. Make no mistake about it. I think some of it we get at with regards to identifying critical skill sets, but that's only part of the problem. Really, most of the skill sets that will be required in time of crisis, particularly in a combat situation, are going to be skills that we're going to teach soldiers. So we're going to rely heavily on the training base to be able to fill that need. Now, TRADOC right now is in the process of reviewing policies and getting back to the Army, speaking specifically for the Army, about what our capacity is and how we can accelerate the timeline. But in a time where we don't measure the speed of war by what it takes to cross on a transoceanic cruise liner, but rather the milliseconds that it takes to be engaged in cyber or space warfare, we are looking for ways to be more agile in that space. By design, the Training and Doctrine Command is built to expand. A couple of the really critical elements that we don't talk about a lot are the activation of the 80th and 108th Training Commands, whose job it is to fill out our drill sergeants and augment the active duty force. And then we also have the ability to call up people who have prior military training, bring them back in as contractors or civilians, and use them for the military occupational specialty, MOS type training, that'll be critical after the initial entry basic training occurs. So it's certainly something we spend a lot of time looking at as we take a look at all the O plans across the world, and we will continue to apply a lot of brain power to that moving forward.
So with what degree of confidence would you say that the Army would be able to make mission if all of a sudden you had 90,000 inductees showing up at your recruit depot?
Well, I think we have a high level of confidence. All of our combatant commanders across the world take a look at their standing operational plans, and they take a look at what their force alignment is. They communicate back to the service departments about what their requirements are, and the service departments plan against that. So it's really getting out the door, which is the critical piece, to build time in order to build combat power across the force. I think we have the capacity to do that, but it is going to require resources, and it'll require probably changes in policy that will allow us to curtail some portions of the training plan now so that we are preparing young men and women for combat, but not doing things that are not necessary for success in combat.
Thank you. General Singh, I'm really intrigued by your state civilian defense force made up of volunteers. Can you tell me, do those folks are they prior service, or are they just civilians that decide they want to engage and help support the National Guard in the state of Maryland?
So we do have some that are prior service. We try to make it so that it's about 50-50, but we really will take someone that has never ever served before. They may not be able to serve. And we look at them and say, what is the specialty skill that you have? And if they don't have something, then there are areas in which we actually train them. But what we've started to be able to do with this particular group is there are places in which I have shortfalls, that I can't do all the things I'm being asked to do and continue to deploy and all of the other things. And we use this force to supplement some of our training and some of our support. And so we've been able to actually turn that into, well, what is their service dollars related to? So if we take the hours, the community service hours that they give, and translate that, almost every single year, we've turned that into almost a $2 million kind of what I would say cost to serve for them. And so that's been helpful for us because they've done some pretty amazing things for us.
And is that something that's unique to the Maryland Guard, or is that something that the Guard does across the states?
So not every single state has one. I think there's only about, I want to say maybe half of the states that have them, and maybe even a little less than that. And, you know, they have been pretty problematic. I mean, previously, I would hate to say, but previously they were the boys' club. And it was problematic in the sense that it was very political. And so when you really want to strip out that force and get to some critical skills, you're then going to recruit in different places. And we do things in schools. We are partnered with University of Maryland, Towson University, Johns Hopkins. And so these individuals are absolutely critical to helping us to partner not just with the colleges and institutions and the schools, but also in looking at our religious partners as well.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ms. Wada.
Thank you. I guess my question is for General Singh and for Dr. Schneider. When we talk about technologists, because cyber seems to be the big attention grabber here wherever you go, you know, in that particular case, bringing people on, even if they have the skills and we expand the age of what is eligible for selective service, actually utilizing them because they don't have a clearance, they don't have sort of the prep that we need them to be able to integrate into our military structure. Like, people who start digging into the details think it sounds good, but it's never going to happen. So is it really necessary that we change the whole system for sort of these little specialized skills when in actuality and practical application we might never be able to get to use them? So what should we be looking at if we're looking at what the selective service should look like in the future, and if there should be changes? How do we get over some of those sort of barriers that we should be aware, one, we should be aware of, but two, like how would we approach those things? Because I'm thinking, is it time for us to bring back an operational reserve, a strategic reserve, since our reserve components has gone to a strategic reserve? Anyway.
So I think we could probably debate the whole operational strategic. That's another whole conversation. But I mean, we do need to look at a model that allows us to get at, and I still say going back into the high schools. Mm-hmm. Because we have to start there, because not everybody's going to go to college, and nor should we be asking everybody to go to college. Because they could be going to trade schools. We leave the trade schools kind of out of it. We leave the community colleges out of it. So we've got to get to that particular population. And I think, you know, if we go back is what is the one thing that every single person has to have? If you are in the U.S., what's the one thing that every single person has to have?
Social Security number?
Social Security card. Everybody has to have one. Yeah. And it's time for us to relook at that anyway, because we need to, from a cyber perspective, protect our Social Security numbers, right? So we need to go to a whole different kind of system, even with that, if we're going to protect identity. And we haven't gotten there yet. So what if we were to look at what is the one thing that every single person in the U.S. has to have? And if that is the one thing, then how do you make it so that if you know they have a Social Security card, then what is it that we need from them? If it's, you know, tracking, registration of skills, how do we get back? Because they're always going to use that Social Security number somewhere, someplace, somehow. And that also ties them back into taxes and everything else, right? So we can find them. Somehow the government seems to find them. So let's just think about the system and how can we use that in a much more efficient manner that allows us to be able to plan for the unmentionable, right? Because we don't know what the future is going to look like. But I will tell you that the system we have today needs to be reinvigorated.
So I want to take on this question about what these individuals with skill sets who maybe don't have clearances could possibly do. And I first want to say that it's a problem even within the active duty. We have this huge backlog, and so you have people who are sitting outside the building waiting to get in for a huge amount of time and, you know, doing almost nothing. But there are actually a lot of really innovative ways that we can use people that don't have security clearances. And one is to think about them as individuals who can build software or some sort of technology tool for a mission, right? Whether that's some sort of software tool for scheduling your flight operations or for handling manning. These particular projects are projects that DIUX has done under its mandate, but those are projects that don't necessarily require clearances, especially for missions in the mission administration that's not, a secret or a top secret job. And too often we think of cyber and technology as being something that looks like the NSA. But the reality is, if we could take, 100 great technologists and fix DTS, they don't need a clearance for that, and that would be fantastic, The other thing, and this is something that Cyber Command has been doing, the team that I'm a part of at Cyber Command, the Points of Partnership team, is a team that takes diverse skills that are not necessarily sitting at Cyber Command. So I have a PhD in political science. I'm sitting at the Naval War College. We have other members of our team who have PhDs in data science, start companies. We have people from venture capital companies. We have individuals who have worked at Google. And so these are kind of top technologists. Most of them don't have a top secret clearance. What they do for Cyber Command is they know what the emerging technologies are. So they understand kind of what's in the art of the possible and what's happening inside the private sector. And so having individuals that can provide a linkage, not only a linkage about informational understanding of where technology is going, but also a face that represents the government that's sitting next to Silicon Valley or technologists every day that show that we really are coming from the same background. So I think there are large roles that individuals without clearances can play.
If I might, you're focusing on individual skills. You should be focusing on mobilization. And a good part of mobilization, certainly that occurred in the post 9/11, was industrial mobilization. These capabilities reside in companies that are specialists. The issue isn't necessarily how you get the individual. The issue is how you get the company. We have whole companies that are cybersecurity specialists. You need to be able to tap them. And there's a whole literature, a whole set of issues on the procurement side about rapid procurement and the involvement of industrial capability into the DoD. That's as much mobilization as the individual, touching the individual at the company to bring them into the military, bring the whole company in. We did this in World War I. We actually, in the medical area, went to hospitals and created reserve units and brought the whole hospital in as a unit and gave reserve commissions to all of the doctor staff in the hospital to fully man a deployed military facility in Europe based upon a hospital in Cleveland, for example. So you need to expand your thinking from the individual to also the institutions.
Great. Mr. Buren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been such a great conversation here. Thank you. Dr. Rosker, I just want to make sure I understand your point to your second observation here in terms of amending or modifying registration to include women. And you stated candidly that you're conflicted, certainly providing equal opportunity, but compelling, referencing your own service in the Carter administration and your perspective, well placed for that. But then saying that it's not really the time, it's not a fight that doesn't need to be fought at this point, which of course is our charge, right? It may not be the right time from your perspective, but is the charge to this commission. So I guess my question is that more of a political analysis that you're providing to us? I mean, you observe you're not a lawyer, so the court cases are what they were.
Absolutely.
So it's solely a political judgment you're rendering.
When you get to that level, it's all political.
Okay, so pretend you're king, and the politics are off the table.
They can't be off the table.
Well, let's pretend.
I can't pretend because we can meet our military obligation with men. We can meet them with men and women. The decision to include women is a cultural decision.
So does it concern you as a cultural decision that we're in a position of 2019, 2020 America where we would affirmatively say no to this possibility? If it's a cultural question now, you said it's a political question, it's a culture. So if it's a cultural question, does it cut the other way in terms of your objective for equity and equal opportunity?
Someone suggested to me that the issue was given to the commission because the Congress didn't want to deal with it. And I would say, as 11 members of the commission, you can represent your personal views, but I don't think you can impose those views on the United States. I think it will eventually have to be the Congress that votes. I mean, you can't change the law. So you can give them your views that you as 11 individuals have voted and decided that, you know, this is what you'd like to do. And do you really think the Congress of the United States is going to say, well, the 11 told us that, we're going to go do it? They're going to face their individual constituencies representing the views of their home and make a judgment. And they cannot, by putting it off 2 years or 3 years and giving it to you, avoid that responsibility. I was just so convinced that registration was the right thing. There was no reason. We would have run a separate draft to fill only women places. And boy, did we get beat up on the Hill because the country was not ready for it. And that's why we have a representative form of government and a Congress in the United States, and they have to face their constituencies.
Any other reflections on this question?
So this is Linda Singh's personal view. We're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And 100 years ago, we weren't ready for that either. Congress was split. The states were split, and we fought, right? Or at least the shoulders that I stand on, they fought. And there were men and women who fought alike to move it forward so women had the right to vote. So what I would ask you is, you know, where are we today? And are we really debating something that should be asked to the future population? Because when I ask my young service members, I'm going to tell you, they look at me and they say, why are we even having this discussion? It should be just settled. And I know that we're culturally not ready for it, but we weren't ready for it 100 years ago, and we did it.
Dr. Snyder?
I think it's hard to make a compelling argument for women in combat if you are then going to say that they're not part of this process. I also think that if the whole point of having this is to create a civic moment, then not letting women participate in it is also poor. And I also think that protecting women from the draft is I would say my personal reaction to that is that that feels a bit condescending.
Mr. Allard.
I was struck, Dr. Russell, about that, if I heard you correctly, you said within 3 months you were able to get a 93% registration rate? July, August, September?
Yes. What happened was we had a plan. Nothing was in place. The president on January 20th said we would register. Okay? It took until June for Congress to vote us the money. In that time frame, that 6 months, we put all the infrastructure in place.
So roughly 9 months.
But a lot of that first 6 months could be negated by planning. Once we had the go-ahead, we were able to implement the registration within a month. And now we registered, I think 1 year, one year group. And we registered it over a 2-week period. It didn't tax the post offices to have the people descend on the post office. We had all of the forms processed and in the computer by the second week in September. The registration, the lottery could have been held at that point. And at that point, we had 93% compliance. 93% of the eligible population was in the computer and 98% accuracy.
I understand.
We had a comparison. We had the previous on-time registration of people within a month of the time they should have registered, and that was 78%. So because of the publicity and the like, we were able to get that kind of penetration.
That's what I wanted to get to, is what was key, absolutely essential to have that? Did President Carter make an announcement?
Oh, we had public service announcements. We had a lot of press coverage. Everyone knew that this was up and running. And the question was, would we have defiance? We effectively invited people to a party and had no idea how many people would show up. Well, the answer was 93% of those invited showed up.
And the driver was at the invasion of Russia?
That was the president's concern,
Okay.
and this was in the face of a lot of opposition from the Republican side. Senator Hatfield particularly led the opposition, but the press at the time was saying, oh, no one's going to show up. We've been to the post office. We don't see anybody there. Well, a million people spread between 32,000 post offices over 2 weeks. You're not going to see very many people.
I find that remarkable, to be honest with you. Director Benton, you say you have run some tests. What have been the findings of those tests? What are your strengths, weaknesses, areas for improvement, and what else would you like to do?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Commissioner. If I may, I just want to touch a little bit on the 1980 numbers before I get into that. If you look at the GAO reports, you'll find that in 1982, the GAO revised those 93% numbers down to 87%. So check into that. It's because they forgot to count all the population and all of our territories and possessions and all of American citizens that are overseas. And so it's really around 87%. It was further reduced in 1997 to 87%. And then in 1980, they reduced that, the GAO reduced that number again to 77% for 1981. So take a look at those numbers. And 2 months, I think, is a misconception. The president announced in January he's going to do it. It took Congress 6 months to fund it. How long do you think it would take today for Congress to fund an effort like that? 6 months later, okay, we start registering. So that America has been told for 7 months they're going to be required to register. They had one common enemy, the Soviets. So understand the circumstances were very different. And with all due respect to the doctor, that was then and this is now. And things are very different today. Electronic registration, whole new deal. In fact, we wouldn't be compliant with the Paperwork Reduction Act if we didn't use electronic registration. So when I first arrived at the agency, I said, how do we know we can do our mission? My boss wants to know, can we do our mission? Well, when was the last time we did an exercise? You're taking too long to answer that question. So we have conducted exercises, absolutely, in phases, different phases, and we found a few glitches, and they're fixed, right? And so that's why when you ask me the question, and when the president asked me the question, are you confident? And my answer is absolutely 100% confident that our database is accurate and up to date, and that our processes are up to date and in place that we can perform our function. So now what our focus is trimming off days from the 193 number, right? We believe we can do that. We're taking actions to make sure that we can do that, especially with telephone numbers, texting, and emails. We can not only reduce costs to the agency, printed letters, but also timeline for activation can be reduced dramatically with these new technologies. And so those are the kinds of things we are doing, right? So just so you know. I hope that answered your question, Commissioner.
Thank you. Just so I want to let the commissioners know that in order to give everybody a chance to ask a second question and to make sure we leave time for public comment, then I'm going to strictly enforce the 5-minute rule. Mr. Barney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Singh, we've had an opportunity as a commission to travel around the country this year and meet a lot of 17 and 18-year-old Linda Singhs who are excited about their service adventures, and I can't think of a better example of professionalism and success than what you've achieved in your career, and thank you very much for being here today and for that service. Once upon a time in the Navy, I was serving in command, and I had an enlisted reserve sailor report in for the 2 weeks of duty. And as I had my initial welcome aboard meeting with this person, I learned that this enlisted sailor was actually a state judge, which points out something that I think you brought out in your earlier testimony, and that is that in our reserve component, we have individuals with remarkable skills and professional achievement who serve and who volunteer to continue serving. I wonder if, based on your experience in the reserve component and in leading, are there things that you have learned that the nation can do to, perhaps like through the MEPS process, whether we're talking about it in a mobilization context or otherwise, to really help to, tools that can help us screen and identify the kind of valuable skills that the military needs so that we can, best channel people into those critical needs that the service might have?
Well, so first off, our process is already designed to do that. I mean, we do, when we're recruiting, we already know where are the needs and how are we going to recruit into those fields. So that process is already set up, and I'm looking at my counterpart here because they're part of the reason why we have those processes, at least on the Army side, that allows us to be able to do that. But if I was to think about, MEPS is kind of one of those things where, what are some of the ways that we can improve that process, because that's a medical process. And asking them to take on more than just focusing in on making sure our folks are medically cleared to kind of come into the service, I think would be asking them just a little bit too much. But I think when we're looking at trying to ensure that people understand what is available to them, what do we need, we have to do more education. And so one of the things that just pops to my mind that's happening in Baltimore this year, the Army is actually doing this where they focused in on specific cities, and that's not just Army, it's Army Reserve and Army Guard, but Army's kind of leading it where we're recruiting in these big cities. And it's because that's an untapped market. It's a place where they really don't know what their options are, and we really need to be educating them before they get to the point of being disqualified. And so when I think about that, part of it is making sure that we're out there and making sure that we're in the community and being engaged. And that's the biggest piece that I think most of my folks are starting to learn, that the more we engage, the more we open the doors, the more that we go into the schools. And it's not like we're going in and saying, hey, you've got to join the National Guard or you need to join the Army. I mean, yeah, we're always wanting to recruit, but we're talking to them about the different types of career paths they can have. Or we're going in and teaching leadership, or we're going in and teaching ethics. It's those types of things where the schools are now opening the doors for us and saying, please, we need more of you coming in and doing these types of things. And we're also doing a course in cyber. And what I will tell you is, there are kids that have some amazing cyber skills and they haven't even graduated school yet. And so, as I watch what's going on across the landscape, I really think that we have to start appealing to this younger group. And if we don't engage them and appeal to them, I think we're missing a huge opportunity here. And so part of what I would hope the commission would really push is to look at how do we engage them from a civic perspective and getting them to really think about how they serve. And there are things that I do, and not everybody has to do that, but there's a group of young men in Baltimore that I pass every single day. they wash my car windows, and they want money. And I give them $1, and I'm always talking to them. I hand them my business card, and I'm saying, hey, you can come into the Guard. I know you're not quite old enough, but you can come into the Guard. Now, when they see me this next week, I have squeegees and new bottle stuff to give to them, along with some Maryland National Guard recruiting materials. So we should always kind of be trying to educate them, and who knows, maybe one of them will join. But the point is that we have to engage them, and we have to engage them where they are.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Benton, in response to Commissioner Skelly's question, you talked about the 41 states who currently have a law that links the system to obtain a driver's license with registering for the Selective Service. And all of those laws were passed by the state legislature and then signed by the governors. And you also indicated that you have conversations with the governors on an ongoing basis. The assumption is that if the decision was made by Congress to change the law and include women in the registration, that those state laws would have to be changed. Because my understanding is that some of those are very specific about the gender and the age group that it applies to. From your perspective in your discussions, do you have any concerns about the viability of that part of the registration process if all of those 41 states would have to re-legislate and re-debate and re-adjudicate that linkage by law between the driver's license and registration for Selective Service?
Terrific question, really good, because we've thought about that. And the more recent ones, in fact, we've just recently added a state, as you know, it's 41 now instead of 40, but that language is generic, right? So we've been kind of forward thinking for a couple of years on the language, but as with everything in America, every state has a different view, and so your comment about that is correct. All those laws are a little bit different in some way. None of them are identical. Many are generic. Many tie it to a federal process, so if the federal law changes, that no change necessary there. But certainly some will, the language is specific and it would require changes. In those states that have already passed those laws, we believe that it would be relatively simple if Congress does make a change for us to go to those states and say, would you make this change? Some states, depending on where they're at, may not like what Congress did, and so that might be a problem for us. Do we believe that it will present a significant issue for our registration numbers? No, we don't. We believe that most of that can be, again, overcome with the proper publicity and the proper funding, but no. Most of the folks that are signing up through the driver's license are doing so because it's convenient. They would sign up through another source if that wasn't available. But it's convenient and it's powerful, and we get them when they're thinking about it as they're going into their own lives, if you will. And so it's a good timing mechanism to have it tied to the driver's license. But we don't think that it would be, the few states, and I'm not sure that I have a number on exactly how many would require changes, but we believe that we could overcome that in short order with the right funding and the right publicity. So no, don't think it would be that significant. And again, we don't differentiate really between a primary or a secondary. There's really no such thing as a secondary registration. They're all primary registrations for us. Some are electronic, some are paper. That's really the only difference. In fact, the ones that come from the DLL are the most accurate, as I mentioned earlier, because of the Patriot Act. But no, we don't see that as a significant issue in terms of changing the DLLs. We think that that would be fairly simple to do, especially if we knew Congress was moving, we would be moving in lockstep with them probably in terms of our legislative efforts.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
So let's return to this question about how can we motivate or inspire more people to serve from various places. So we've, I'm looking at Dr. Schneider as well as Major General Evans in particular. For General Evans, you know, you mentioned in your opening comments that, you know, what, 70% of people, young people, don't even qualify to serve. So you're out there giving out squeegees with the, you know, National Guard emblem on it, you know, but they may not even be qualified. Are there some standards or things that we do in the military that people, it doesn't, whether you agree or disagree, that people have identified as maybe it's time to relook this? I mean, I've heard things about tattoos and hair, and, you know, maybe your parents put you on Ritalin when you were 13 and that disqualifies you, whatever. Are there some categories like that where we could just sort of low-hanging fruit and, not to lower the quality of our fighting force, but to be more inclusive in a way in our high-tech environment where we could bring more people in?
You know, thanks, Honorable Davis, and I appreciate the comment and the question, and you're right. So we are currently in the Army, and I'll speak for the Army here. We've got a talent management task force that's looking at lots of different elements of that. So do we have our medical standards where they need to be? Do we have some of the policies that tend to deal with how we present ourselves? Are they the right policies for this day and age? And there's pretty spirited discussion at senior leader levels about those types of things. I will tell you that our Secretary is unequivocal about the fact that we must sustain a standard. He is absolutely unwilling to reduce that standard, and I applaud him for that, because ultimately it is leaders that get to deal with that when we reduce the standard. And we're also looking at, you know, financial incentives. I think Dr. Schneider said, hey, it's hard to compete from a money standpoint with some of the industry that's out there right now, with unemployment being as low as it is. It's a challenge. And as we used to say in SOF, I don't do it for the money, but the money don't hurt, you know, when you're offering somebody a bonus or something like that. So we are looking at levers that help. But I think principally, and I'm looking at your emblem up there on the two screens behind you, it comes back to that word service. And it comes back to really your website there, Inspire. What are we doing to inspire young people to be willing to serve? We talk a lot about millennials, but what's interesting is the millennials are kind of gone. They're too old. They're aged out.
Next gen.
So it's Gen Z, right? Or the iGen, or whatever you want to call them. They are motivated by different factors. As we dig into this, as we take a look at the data, we're finding that in some regards, they tend to be a little more thoughtful about service than some of our millennials were. And I don't like putting stamps on any group or generation. But my point is, I think we can reach them at a level that has to do with a desire to serve. And I think we are better served when we present them a good picture of what service means to the nation, as opposed to saying, hey, here's an extra $10,000 if you'll join the Army. So I don't know if that helps with your question.
Dr. Schneider?
So I'm going to take a little bit of a contrarian position here. The first thing is, I think even the language in which we discuss this belies bias that we have. So reduce the standards. I don't think that's the right way to look at it. Yeah, make the standards equivalent to what we expect out of them. So do we expect that all of our force is going to be on the ground carrying large loads across difficult terrain? I mean, we're looking at a conflict in Asia Pacific. How much of that conflict is that? Right? I've heard in the discussions, for example, about the Army's new rollout of their PT program, the discussion about, hey, we want our soldiers to be capable of conducting the Korea missions from 1950, which makes sense, right? Korea is one of the AORs that we look at all the time. But we're not investing in technologies that represent that same type of conflict. So what we want right now is we want our soldiers to be extraordinarily physically fit and be able to operate all these up-to-date technologies that are extraordinarily complex. And I think the reality is there's got to be some give and take, especially if what we're talking about is a conflict where we're going to have to mobilize forces that can't all be high-tech, high physical fitness standards. We're going to have to think about what we're going to give and what we really value. And it really depends on the types of conflict that we think we're going to opt into and the way in which we're going to fight them. And right now, we are investing in technologies and conflicts that are more long distance. And because of that, I think that We can't apply all the same standards to all the same forces. I also think that what individuals really want is to feel valued. And I think that some of the things that we discount about how they feel valued, prioritizing their time, for example, I don't think that's a millennial issue. I don't think that's a new gen issue. I think it's just prioritizing people and showing people that even though they're serving and we appreciate their service, that service isn't above how we value them.
Great, thank you.
General Evans, in your testimony, you talk about JROTC and the number of schools that you're in. There are two numbers, 1,709 Army JROTC units, and then there's 3,400 JROTC programs. What's the difference between those two?
Yeah, I apologize if my numbers were unclear. In the Army, we have 1,709 junior ROTC programs that we sponsor. DOD-wide, there are 3,400. So that would be the Air Force, Marines, and Navy that have the others.
Okay. So I guess that means you're in 3,400 high schools. Do you have an estimate of how many high schools you're not in? And what are the obstacles to getting into more of the high schools?
So in rough terms, there's about 33,000 high schools in the United States. So we're in roughly 11% from a DOD perspective. And the Army represents half of that number for junior ROTC, over 300,000 kids. The biggest obstacle, frankly, is funding. The way the junior ROTC program is administered is that the school systems hire the instructors. We certify them in the Army. And then we basically pay about half of their salary. We bring them back to the level that they would be at if they were still on active duty. There's a formula for it. It's a little complex, but it's basically half. And then we provide the equipment for the program. The school provides the space, things like that. But there is a bill to DOD, and we fund that at a certain level. And we've decided collectively not to fund it beyond that level. So that's why.
We've heard from some that recruiters are not allowed onto high school campuses or discouraged from visiting. Are you seeing that there are schools that you'd like to be in, but the administration is telling you, no, we'd rather that you not be here?
So, I've heard anecdotally that we're having trouble accessing some areas, and my good friend at Fort Knox, Major General Frank Muth, is the commander of the United States Army Recruiting Command, so he owns that recruiting force. And I will tell you that there are areas where we have a little bit of friction trying to get into the high schools. Some of that challenge, frankly, comes from how we reward student performance in the high schools. For instance, we will reward the school district by virtue of how many people they have that matriculate to college, but they don't get any credit for people who go on to serve in the military. I think that's problematic. I think that's something we should look at holistically. But what we are finding is that in the districts that have junior ROTC programs, they are absolutely the crown jewel. The superintendents, the principals, the administrators I talk to love it. The kids graduate at higher rates. You have less teen pregnancy. You have less gang violence. You have higher GPAs. You have a better school to career or school to college path for those young people. So it's a great program, and one that I'm a huge fan of because we didn't have it in my high school.
And what's the number one attribute of JROTC, serving in it, that would increase a young person's propensity to want to serve in the military?
What I have found is that it is the fact that we provide structure where there may be structure lacking. It really is a citizenship and character program. It's not meant as a recruiting tool. We do get some benefits from recruiting, but what we find is when I talk to the instructors and they point to me at a child who may be a high-risk youth, comes from a high-risk environment, is that what they were lacking wasn't mental acuity or the ability to do things or even physical fitness. It was the fact they didn't have structure in their home life, and junior ROTC provides them that structure.
Great. Thank you very much.
General Evans, I understand that you need to depart at 15:25 to catch a flight.
I can continue to stay.
All right,
until
sir, so
time.
please feel free, I mean, take leave,
Okay.
whatever you need to take leave to make
If I
your
do.
flight.
My
Appreciate
aide right now is working on another flight for me, I guarantee you.
it. Very good, sir. Ms. Haynes.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try to pack a lot into my 5 minutes, but let me try it with this. One thing that's been suggested to us is in the context of if we continue the selective service registration, if that's our recommendation, that there be an opportunity at that moment to give young people who sign up, essentially, an opportunity to learn about civilian, public service, national service opportunities to sort of indicate, look, there are a whole series of different ways in which you might serve, and that both that information would be useful to them, provide some access potentially, but also to send the message that there are so many different ways to serve, and that also might be an opportunity to facilitate them to enlist in registration that would actually then track their skills to some extent. I'd love any reactions to that.
Let me just say, we do a little of that now. In fact, when we follow up and mail to a registrant, regardless of the method of registration, they also receive in that material on opportunities in the armed forces. So it would be relatively easy to add to that public service opportunities as well, right? So we already partner with the Army and DOD in terms of recruiting, because if an individual is signed up to register, then why not let them know that there's some great career opportunities in the military? And so we use that relationship and that partnership to help promote or at least educate what the opportunities are in the military. As you know from your work, about 1% of the population is touched today by someone that serves, as opposed to a much higher, 15, 20, 30 years ago. So these kinds of partnerships where we're able to educate people on what the opportunities are very important, I think, for the nation. And so we're happy to participate in that with the Department of Defense in that regard. And I think we could certainly do the same thing with, public service.
Pragmatically, are you going to give people some information about how to apply to do these things? Because, I've never successfully gotten through a USA Jobs, to an interview.
Yes, no question there's an additional piece to the barriers to public service and national service across the board, without question. Yes, absolutely. All right, let me confirm something that I think was indicated in relation to the answer to my question and also to Deborah's question, I think, but just to make sure I've got it right. It sounds like there is a sense that it would be useful to basically have more information about what people's skills are, but recognizing that what we want today in terms of skill sets is going to be different than what we're going to want in the future. So it has to be flexible, and it has to be something that isn't just tracking the 19 to 25-year-olds. It's broader, ARC, all of those things. That's fair? Okay. All right. Thank you. A second piece, I think, is just this question of, in that context, if you go down this road, you, General Singh, pointed out something I certainly have a lot of sympathy for, which is that the Social Security number as our ID across the board has a lot of vulnerabilities that we should be mindful of. If there were a kind of a broader registration or opportunity to basically provide this information, to have access to additional information, assuming we fix USA Jobs and a variety of other things, right? Is that something that you see as valuable as a general matter?
I think that if you made the appeal, say that you go to a national ID, whether it's Social Security number with some kind of authentication, to say that not only are we going to be asking you to provide some skill sets, but we can start keeping your data even more safely. I think that appeals to almost everyone. But we would have to have a guarantee that we can do that, which means we have to kind of take a step back and say, okay, how are we going to look at that? How are we going to first fix the problem that now everybody has, which is, their personal information? Because that, I think, is going to be the challenge, is I can give you my skill sets, I can tell you what I'm doing, but can you keep it safe? Are you going to be able to protect it? And so let's look at Social Security number. Let's look at making it more secure. And then let's say, okay, since you have Social Security number, you need to get a job anyway. Is there a way that we can link that to skills?
I just, General Evans, to the extent that you have a personal opinion about whether or not women should be included in the registration requirement, I'd love to hear it, but that was it.
So that's a policy issue that I will defer on because I'm not a policy guy. But what I will tell you is I have served with women my entire career, and there is absolutely no differentiation with regards to their capability and attributes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Major General Evans, if there's a chance you might miss a flight, we might as well get some money out of that and keep going to that well. I appreciate you staying with us. Over the last several years, there's been a large and often pointed conversation, continual conversation about the Department of Defense being able to access critical skills and people mid-career that have developed skills through experience and time. On behalf of I'm here on behalf of TRADOC hat on. How's the Army doing with the authorities that it has been given over time and the chance to access people mid-career who might be low-density, high-demand type folks?
Yeah, no, thank you, Commissioner, for that question. You know, as I alluded to earlier, we're looking holistically at talent management right now to see how we can activate better levers for some of that.
Because it's a real paradigmatic shift.
It is.
Go after
So
people.
it's identifying those people, which is hard in and of itself because it's not like we got this big database to draw from. But it's also then trying to encourage and inspire them to want to serve, which is a different problem. But what I will offer, because we've spent a lot of time talking about critical skills, and there is certainly an element of that with regards to rapid mobilization or large mobilization. But since Dr. Schneider took the contrarian view a few minutes ago, I'll take it with her now. And that is, the largest consumer historically of the draft has been the Army. And they've been a consumer because basically what we've needed is, hard-charging folks on the ground with rifles in their hands, taking it to the enemy. We can teach people to do that. The bigger issue is their fitness and ability to be able to do that. So while I can appreciate her point on, should we kind of take a look at what the paradigm is right now and shift that, I think there's space to have that conversation. But the number one resiliency factor in the crucible of ground combat is physical fitness, without a doubt. This is why we've made the turn the way we have with the Army Combat Fitness Test, and this is why I am so concerned, as is the recruiting command commander and the TRADOC commander and the chief of staff and the Secretary of the Army with the general level of fitness in our society. If we know that 3 out of 10 kids out there is physically, mentally, and legally eligible to serve, that's 30% to start with. And that is not a real good place to be if you've got to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people in a time of combat. So with absolute respect for Dr. Snyder's point on that, we believe that's a pretty significant piece of the pie. We're going to bring people in and we're going to give them the skills that they don't have in order to be effective in the jobs that we align them with. But I think you're hitting on something that's very important, and that is how do we figure out what the menu of options are with all the skills that are out there that we could employ.
Thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you all. This has been a great discussion. So my question is for Major General Evans. I also want to build off of what my colleague, Commissioner Kilgannon, was asking you about JROTC, and also referencing what Major General Singh said about we got to get kids in high school, which I think is right. As we traveled the country, we actually met some fabulous high school students who are in JROTC, so congratulations. So we're the Commission on Military, National, and Public Service, and it's the first time actually that all three have been brought under the same umbrella, which we really see as an opportunity, and the folks in Congress have the foresight to bring this together. So, and we've also learned that, as you know better than I do, more people from the South tend to join the military than people from where I am in the Northeast. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts.
True.
Would you be open to, and I think some of the difficulty of getting to some high schools in part of the country is because there's just concern about the military. Would you be open to, Major General Evans, developing a pilot program, potentially in partnership with the Corporation for National and Community Service, where you'd get exposed to what JROTC does, but also have a program that exposes you to civilian national service opportunities, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, Youth Build, et cetera, as a way both to expand the program and also bring it, it's not in my daughter's high school, Brookline High School. I'd love to see it there. I think if it was presented that way, folks in Brookline might say, oh, that's a great opportunity, let's expose young people to both. Would you be open to trying to develop a program like that that would offer young people both exposure to the military and civilian service opportunities?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. I think the answer is as long as I don't have to pay for it. I will tell you, I think it's a great question. So, all of our junior ROTC cadets, like our ROTC cadets and like our soldiers, have a creed that they have to talk about. They have to memorize it. And it includes elements of service, just service, because we build junior ROTC on the military model to give it structure and to give it form. But what we are really trying to achieve with the program is teaching people about character. And so I think we've already got the roots of that embedded in the junior ROTC program. I certainly am not qualified to say what the department will or won't do in that regard, but I think it would not be a far cry for us to include elements of other types of service besides the military. There are obviously other service organizations out there for young people in the high schools, and I mentioned a couple of them, I think, in my comments with Scouting and 4-H and others. But I think talking about service is important. I think we've got to do that. We've got young people that are coming up now that, right, wrong, and indifferent, we continue to tell them to think about themselves. We teach them to seek self-actualization, and that's fine. I think it's a great place for everybody to get to. But we also need to talk to them about selflessness, and we need to talk to them about service. And we're probably not talking as loud about that as we need to.
Thank you very much. I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Casey, and Director Benton, General Evans, General Singh, Dr. Schneider, Dr. Oscar. We greatly appreciate your time today, and thank you for providing valuable information to the Commission. We'll now dismiss the panelists. If you'd like to take seats in the front row during public comment, or, sir, if you need to catch a flight, we appreciate your participation today. The Commission is committed to transparency and openness with the public. In keeping with these principles, the Commission intends to provide the public with an opportunity to deliver public comments during our hearings. As a reminder, in order to provide the greatest opportunity for as many participants to offer a comment as would like, public comment is limited to a 2-minute period per person. As is noted on our website, sign up for public comment took place between the opening of registration and the start of this hearing. When you signed up, you received a numbered ticket. To ensure fairness, tickets were randomly drawn. We will call out 5 ticket numbers at a time and ask that when your number is called, please come forward and make a line behind the mic located to my right, your left, and provide your comment. On the easel to my left and your right, you will also see the ticket numbers in order that you should line up. If time does not permit you to offer your oral comment, we encourage you to submit your written comment at our website, inspiredtoserve.gov. Additionally, if you have any written statements that you would like to submit for the record, please provide them to staff at the registration desk. I now invite tickets 43, 35, 39, 37, and 32 to come forward and line up at the microphone here. Please, if all 5 would come up and line up now so we can move through the comments expeditiously. And 43, 35, 39, 37, 32. During your comment, please be aware of the lights in front of me. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds remaining, and red when time is expired. You will also hear a buzzer. Please, when you see the red light and hear the buzzer, conclude your comments. Number 43, if you'd identify yourself and your affiliation and provide your comment. 35.
Commission members and staff, I am Dean Hess, Colonel USA Air Force retired, a senior advisor to SOS America. As a retired Air Force officer and business consultant, concerned about the need for continuing renewal of our country, I commend the SOS America initiative to you as a part, and hopefully a big part, of the solution to respond to national emergencies. If implemented, our program would give citizens military training prior to mobilization and allow the military services to set up and support additional training resources that could be used for mobilization requirements, a key shortfall in our current plan. As I said this morning, General Borling has testified here in Washington with you, And I want to emphasize that only a small percent of our young men and women qualify physically and mentally for the all-volunteer force. We support the need to expand the opportunity for military non-combatant training and service for our young citizens. We advocated affordable one-year small unit military experience, mixing geography, backgrounds, and ages in a small unit of young people to take care of themselves as they would based on their ability for strenuous requirements that's not in the all-volunteer force requirements. Absent exemption and given command, they would train and serve in platoons of 30, in companies of 100, and respond to non-combatant mission needs. You've heard this morning about positive motivations for national service. I would end with saying that if funded, national service could allow participants a vehicle to pay off loans, scholarships, and a path to citizenship. Thank you for your...
Thank you, Colonel. Number 39, you want to step forward, please identify yourself and your affiliation and provide your comment.
Hi, my name is Brian Kim. I'm with the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, senior staff engineer. I was once a naturalized citizen in 1988, and currently also a U.S. Air Force reservist. I supported a Space Command operator serving in the northern tier of our country. When I swore in 1988, I still vaguely remember, but I have to bring it up on the website. Some of the things I had refresh my mind on why I came to the United States. And one of the things that sworn oath to the United States of America is that I will bear arms on behalf of the United States when required by the law, that I will perform non-combatant services in the armed forces of the United States when required by the law, and I will perform work of national importance under civilian direction when required by law. That's my obligation. And I also did the sworn to defend the Constitution of the United States when I was sworn as a second lieutenant. As a lieutenant colonel currently serving the United States service, and it's more important for us to really remember why we joined and why we're doing and why I came here in the United States. One other thing I would like to share with you is that something I read in the Lincoln Memorial. It says, I am not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and constitutions, but laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind as it becomes more developed, more enlightened. As new discoveries are made, new truth discovered, and manners and opinions change, with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times. We might as well require many men to wear still the code which fitted when a boy as a civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarian ancestors. We have an opportunity to change the law that has been exist for several years. You, commissioners, have an opportunity to make the change and make the suggestions. I think we're in a place where we can make the changes. I think where many panelists have suggested that changes needs to be made. I think we have an obligation to do just so. I just want to make the statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Number 37. Again, introduce yourself and provide your comment.
Hello, my name is Bill Galvin. I'm the counseling coordinator at the Center on Conscience and War. We were founded in 1940 to protect the rights of conscientious objectors. I think the best thing this panel could do to help conscientious objectors is to recommend that draft registration end for men and women. But what I really want to talk about now is the issue of a CO checkoff box or some way to acknowledge you're a conscientious objector at the time of registration. I have talked to thousands of conscientious objectors, probably tens of thousands. I've been doing this a long time. Most of them have registered as the law requires. Some of them have not, and it's for them a matter of conscience. They feel that to even register with selective service is a form of participation in war. Earlier in this panel today, the Director of Selective Service called selective service our third tier of defense. And this morning, members of the commission were asking panelists about the deterrent effect of having the registration. So the registration has been used in that way. And people of conscience cannot just say, yeah, I'm going to put my name in there and allow myself to be used that way. So for some of them, having this checkoff box or some way to acknowledge you're a CO when you register would allow them to register. I'm not going to say that's going to make a huge difference in the registration rates. I think it probably won't make much of a difference, but it will make a huge difference for some people of conscience and allow them to register and not be penalized in all the ways that have been talked about this afternoon. So I think that's a pretty important thing to do. The other thing I wanted to mention is that earlier today, the Director of Selective Service mentioned that when people get registered by a driver's license or some way like that, that they are aware of what they're doing, that everybody reads the fine print when they fill out a government form. That's not true, okay? And we get calls at our office from people who say, I just got a registration acknowledgement, but I didn't register for the draft. And of course, when we talk with them we come to find out that they did something like get a driver's license or fill out the FAFSA that got them registered. So we need to be aware that this is a real issue for a lot of people. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Number 32, you can come forward, and I'll also call up now 41, 34, 33, 36, and 38. Go ahead, sir.
I'm David Siegel. I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Maryland. I directed the Army's sociological research program during the early years of the all-volunteer force. I serve on the Army Educational Advisory Committee, and I'm also a local Selective Service Board member. I've been studying military personnel issues for about a half a century, and there are a couple of surge issues that I want to speak to. One is just to remind you that whatever we do with regard to gender, if we're going to treat men and women equally, whether we register them or keep it in abeyance until we have a national emergency, you're doubling the size of the population that the system has to deal with. And in talking about what resources are necessary to do anything, that needs to be kept in mind. Dr. Rosker mentioned the issue of what happens after mobilization when people start coming into the military. We actually run that experiment every summer because voluntary enlistments increase at the end of the school year. In the last year, I visited all 4 of the Army's basic training centers, and all of them experience summer surges. And they deal with it amazingly, largely by drawing on the reserve components to provide additional drill sergeants. To my knowledge, they have not taxed the National Guard very heavily. But I suspect that were we to go to a larger national mobilization, that is the way we would do it. We would implement a call for service to National Guard drill sergeants, and that simply means that they've got to be qualified to do what they're doing. A number of years ago, I participated in a study at the Center for Strategic International Studies on junior ROTC. And was amazed by the number of high schools that wanted junior ROTC units that could not get them because the services were not providing the funding for all of that. There have been 2 interesting studies of public junior ROTC, public military academy secondary schools, one in Chicago, one here in Prince George's County. They've had phenomenal success. The reason high schools want these programs is that for most of them that have them, it is the major extracurricular activity available for the students. Without JROTC, they wouldn't have anything. And they find that JROTC increases discipline, increases attendance, increases graduation. And all of those are good things, and that's something that this commission should take very seriously. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, sir. Number 41. No? 34?
Hi, my name's Ariana Standish, and I'm a freshman at UC Berkeley. And looking around this room, my brother, Callum, and I are the only ones who would be affected by this decision on the draft. And I'm 19, and my brother's 15, and in a few years, if the selective service is extended to women, we both have to register. And Director Benton made the point that registering for the selective service is a marker of adulthood and something that young men are excited about because they're going to serve their country. I do not believe it should be a marker of adulthood. It is something mandatory, not something you choose to do like voting, not something you work hard to do like graduating high school or getting into college, but something that you're forced to do by the law. And you're forced to give up your private information to military recruiters. And should there be a draft, should we go to war, you're forced to give up your freedom. And that should not be a marker of adulthood. That should not be our civic duty. For me, my civic duty is going to school, getting an education, and getting a career where I choose to help society, and it's not being a backup resource for the military. And Benton also talked about the benefits to registering for the Selective Service. There is no benefit. The only benefit is that you don't go to jail, that you don't get denied federal funding, you don't pay a hefty fine. So that's not a benefit. Those are negative reinforcements to force you to do something. And I just think that needs to be made clear. It shouldn't be a marker of adulthood.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Number 33.
Good afternoon. My name is Kate. I'm the parent of 2 draft-age children. I was draft age myself when the Selective Service was reinstated 40 years ago. And I come here, I came with Ari and Callum. We flew out from California, and you're maybe wondering why. Why did we make this trip? Why is it so important to us to come and testify to you all that we do not think that the Selective Service should continue? I'm very troubled today listening to the comments by the panelists this morning and even some of the comments by you that talk about things that, like that the Selective Service generates up to 80,000 leads for the military, that the Selective Service partners with the military to recruit people. And I have this experience because my son, who registered under protest, when he got the confirmation, it had a little tag for recruitment into the Marines. I think that what's the elephant in the room here is student privacy and confidentiality. That why is the Selective Service collecting this information? It's because the government, whoever, that the powers that be want to be able to track and monitor where people are. They want to show them that they can tell them what to do. And I do not believe that that is a way to encourage public service, okay? When we went down to Cal State LA, and they asked the panel, which included AmeriCorps and a couple other service agencies, should your method of service, your voluntary service, should that be coercive? Should that be mandatory? And they all said no. I talked to the Peace Corps person, and I asked her, well, you think that if you get a letter in the mail and it says you don't register to go into the Peace Corps, you'll get sent to jail or fined $250,000? Does that sound okay? But the main thing here is I don't like that people's information is being collected, that they have to give up their information, and a list is kept that then could be used to contact them and get a hold of them and tell them, hey, let's go fight.
Thank you, and thank you for making the trip. Number 36. No? 38.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, thank you all very much for the work you're doing. I'm Tim Miller with the Conservative Anabaptist Service Program. We work closely with Selective Service, the Alternative Service Section, and while we acknowledge the right and responsibility of government to protect and care for its citizens in the way that it thinks best, as followers of Jesus Christ, we also believe very deeply that we are called to service to our fellow man in ways that build up rather than destroy, even to the extent of eschewing personal defense. As was alluded to by Mr. Galvin's comments this morning about the Hutterites, in previous history, we would see that when the military is responsible for conscription, things turn out rather tragically for conscientious objectors, as we saw in the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War I. In World War II, and since then, things have been a lot better with the conscription run by a civilian agency. And our request would be that whatever changes are made, that conscription would continue to be overseen by, or whatever registration or plans are made would be overseen by a civilian agency rather than the military. Also, in response to Dr. Roscoe's comments, checking off the box would make us feel a lot better. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Number 40.
I'm Major General Dennis Leitch, United States Army retired. I just have two quick data points to bring to the dialogue. The first one is with regard to a mass mobilization. There was a question about can the Army absorb it? And it's a legitimate question, but I would just bring up the point that we now have almost 10,000 recruiters in the U.S. Army, most of whom are high-speed NCOs who would make great instructors. So there's a pool of people waiting to be out of the recruiting business and into the business of what NCOs do best. The other one is that with this thing of cyber warriors and skill sets, I sensed an assumption that it would be easier to do it with an all-volunteer force as opposed to a conscripted force. But let me just go through 3 lines of what I refer to as all-volunteer force arithmetic. The first line is that about 4 million people turn 18 every year in the United States. The second one is that only 30% can meet the minimum qualifications for enlistment into the military. That leaves you with 1.2 million. Only 15% have a propensity to serve, which gets you to 180,000. But in that 1,020,000, between the 1.2 million and 180,000 who are able to serve but unwilling to serve, I suspect there are quite a few National Merit Scholars and valedictorians who would make great cyber warriors, and also a number of all-state linebackers who would make great 11 Bravos. And when we look at the trade-off between willing and able and what we're dealing with now, I think that we need to look at those math, that arithmetic. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Number 42.
Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts with you. I'm one of those 11,000 volunteers working for the agency Selective Service System. I served in Portland, Oregon, and now in District of Columbia. Selective service is definitely needed, necessary. We do not buy insurance to save money or invest. We spend money we spend money to have insurance. And I see the agency's role as necessary insurance for our defense. And also, at one point, one of the panelists mentioned about the company, private sector's volunteer in the national emergency. I can't really say that the private sector will be passionate about our nation's priority. I'm coming from the private sector, and I can tell you. And therefore, we definitely need our own independence as a selective service system. And another thing I would like to mention is we need modernized policy. We are in Industry 4.0. We have to utilize the intellectual diversity. And I believe that women are as powerful as men when we are talking about the brain power, especially in this science and technology-oriented world. Guess what? We are in the war, and the adversary has way more population. I would not say brain power, but population today. So I would like to ask you guys, to consider the modernized policy. And the last thing I would like to mention is we need resources and the strategy for innovation of the agency. We are not communicating with the citizens at the level of the post-millennial Z generation. So we definitely need a communication strategy. Also, in order to advance the registration system, as well as better preparedness, we need innovation. The Department of Defense is moving forward faster, better, and cheaper strategy. Why not selective services system? Thank you.
Great. Could you please identify yourself for the record?
My name is Dr. Hunju Lee, and I'm very proud of being a volunteer in the selective services system.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I believe that was the last ticket number that we had pulled, number 42. So I again want to thank our panelists for providing their testimony today, Gallaudet University for hosting us, and all of those in attendance who took the time to attend today's proceedings. It's only with your help and input that the Commission will achieve its vision, every American inspired and eager to serve. There being no further business before this Commission, the hearing is adjourned.
The National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service holds another public hearing tomorrow. We'll have live coverage